Chapter 1. The Return. The tabby cat that materialized on Privet Drive at 5:30 in the morning bore no resemblance to the confident professor who had stood in the Hogwarts staff room the evening before, grading transfiguration essays with mechanical precision. Minerva McGonagall settled her feline form into the shadow of a hedge across from number 4, her amber eyes fixed on the house that had haunted her dreams for 10 years. 10 years. A decade since she had sat in this exact spot, well, near enough, watching the Dursleys with growing unease. The memory surfaced with painful clarity, her own voice, sharp with concern, cutting through the November night air. I've watched them all day. They're the worst sort of muggles imaginable. Dumbledore's dismissal had been gentle but firm. The boy would be safer here than anywhere else, he'd said. The blood protection would keep him alive. Alive. The word tasted bitter, even in memory. She shifted position, her cat's body moving with the fluid grace that decades of animagus practice had perfected, and studied the house before her. The dawn light revealed changes, fresh paint on the window frames, new guttering, a pristine garden that spoke of suburban prosperity. The Dursleys had done well for themselves in the intervening years. But what of the boy? The boy who should have been celebrating his 11th birthday in little over a week. The boy whose Hogwarts letter sat waiting in her office, sealed and ready for delivery. Movement in an upstairs window caught her attention. A curtain twitched, not the frilly, flowered curtains of what she remembered as the master bedroom, but something else. Something that looked suspiciously like a towel hung across a smaller window, her stomach clenched with an unease she couldn't name. The front door of number 4 opened with a bang that echoed across the quiet street. Vernon Dursley emerged, his bulk barely contained by a purple dressing gown, his face already flushed with the particular shade of red that McGonagall remembered from that long-ago night. Behind him came a woman, Petunia, thinner than McGonagall remembered, her neck craned forward like a hunting bird. "Boy!" Vernon's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "Get out here. Those weeds won't pull themselves." McGonagall's ears pricked forward, every feline instinct sharpening. Boy, not Harry, not even the child's name. The door remained open, but no one emerged. Vernon's face darkened to a deeper shade of purple, and he stomped back inside. McGonagall heard the thunder of his footsteps, the slam of what sounded like a door. No, something smaller. Something that creaked on old hinges. "I said get out here!" Vernon's voice was muffled now, coming from inside the house. "Don't make me come down there again!" There was a scrambling sound, a voice too quiet to make out words, and then footsteps on stairs. Quick, light footsteps that spoke of someone trying very hard not to be heard. When the boy appeared in the doorway, McGonagall's heart stopped. This was not the cherubic toddler she had glimpsed 10 years ago, sleeping peacefully in Hagrid's massive arms. This was a stick-thin child who looked several years younger than his nearly 11 years, with hair that hung in greasy tendrils around a face that was all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. His clothes, if the oversized stained garments could be called clothes, hung off his small frame like tents. The boy's eyes darted nervously from Vernon to Petunia, and McGonagall caught a glimpse of startling green before he ducked his head submissively. Lily's eyes, in a face that spoke of hunger and fear. "About time," Vernon grunted. "Garden's a disgrace. I want every weed gone before I get back from work, and if I find so much as one dandelion, you'll spend the rest of the week in your room. Understand?" The boy, Harry, she forced herself to think, his name is Harry, nodded quickly. "Yes, Uncle Vernon. And don't even think about shirking. Petunia will be watching." Vernon jerked his head toward his wife, who was eyeing the child with an expression of distaste that made McGonagall's claws dig into the earth beneath her paws. "Dudley's got swimming lessons this afternoon, so you'd better be done by the time we get back." With that, Vernon disappeared back into the house, leaving Harry standing alone on the doorstep. For a moment, the boy simply stood there, and McGonagall caught sight of his profile, the sharp jut of cheekbones that should have been rounded with baby fat, the prominent collarbones visible through his thin shirt. When he moved to the small shed at the side of the house to retrieve gardening tools, his movements were careful and deliberate, as if he were trying to make himself as small and unnoticeable as possible. The sun was climbing higher now, promising a scorching June day. Already, McGonagall could feel the heat building, even in her shaded hiding spot. Harry worked steadily, pulling weeds from flower beds that were clearly maintained to a standard of perfection that would have impressed even the most demanding Hogwarts groundskeeper. His thin shirt was soon soaked with sweat, clinging to a frame that was far too small for a boy his age. McGonagall forced herself to remain still, to observe, even as every instinct screamed at her to intervene. This was Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the child whose very existence had given the wizarding world hope, and he was pulling weeds like a house elf, his thin hands shaking with exhaustion as the morning wore on. A splash from the back garden drew her attention. Moving carefully, McGonagall crept along the hedge until she had a clear view of the rear of the property. What she saw made her stomach turn. There, in the shade of a brand-new gazebo, beside what appeared to be an enormous swimming pool, lounged a boy who could only be Dudley Dursley. He had grown into a miniature version of his father, round, red-faced, and supremely satisfied with himself. A table beside his lounge chair groaned under the weight of snacks, crisps, chocolate, fizzy drinks. He was flipping lazily through what appeared to be a comic book, occasionally glancing up to watch Harry work in the blazing sun. "Oi, freak!" Dudley called out, his voice carrying the casual cruelty that McGonagall had heard in the voices of schoolyard bullies for decades. "Dad says you'd better not mess up the roses. They're Mum's pride and joy." Harry's hand stilled for just a moment before resuming their work. He didn't look up, didn't respond, but McGonagall caught the slight hunch of his shoulders, the way he seemed to fold in on himself. The morning stretched on. McGonagall watched in growing horror as Harry worked without a break, without water, without so much as a word of acknowledgement from the family inside. Twice, Petunia emerged to hang laundry on a line, stepping carefully around Harry as if he were a piece of garden furniture. Once, she actually nudged him aside with her foot when he was working too close to her precious roses. It was just past noon when Harry swayed dangerously, his thin form wavering like a reed in the wind. McGonagall tensed, ready to abandon her hiding spot, but Harry caught himself against the garden wall and continued working. His movements were slower now, less coordinated. His face, what she could see of it, was flushed red with heat and exhaustion. The end, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable. Harry had moved to a flower bed near the kitchen window, working to remove a stubborn patch of clover that had taken root among Petunia's prized petunias. McGonagall, from her new position near the front gate, had a clear view through the window into the kitchen beyond. What she saw there made her blood run cold. The cupboard under the stairs, that small, cramped space she remembered from her surveillance 10 years ago, now sported 2 heavy padlocks, industrial-grade locks that would not have looked out of place on a prison cell. Scratches around the doorframes suggested they had been in use for some time. She was still staring in shock when Harry's legs simply gave out. He crumpled to the ground like a marionette with cut strings, his small body folding in on itself as consciousness fled. For a heartbeat, McGonagall expected someone to come running. Surely they would notice that the boy, barely more than a child, had collapsed from heat exhaustion and overwork. Instead, Vernon Dursley appeared at the kitchen door, took one look at Harry's prone form, and let out a sound of disgust. "Lazy little freak," he muttered, grabbing Harry under the arms and hauling him to his feet. Harry's head lolled, unconscious, as Vernon half dragged, half carried him toward the house. Can't even do a simple job without making a production of it. McGonagall watched in mounting horror as Vernon opened the cupboard door, those terrible padlocks clicking open with practiced ease, and shoved Harry's limp body inside. The boy hit the far wall with a sickening thud before sliding to the floor of what could barely be called a room. The door slammed shut. The padlocks clicked into place. And Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Transfiguration Professor, and loyal member of the Order of the Phoenix, crouched in her cat form, behind a hedge, and finally understood what 10 years of willful blindness had cost. Every fear she had voiced that November night had come to pass. Every warning she had given had been ignored. And somewhere in that locked cupboard, Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the child who had saved them all, lay unconscious and alone, trapped in conditions that would have made a house elf weep. The taste of failure was bitter in her mouth as she finally admitted the truth she had spent 10 years trying to avoid. Dumbledore had been wrong. Chapter 2. The Investigation. 3 days. Minerva McGonagall had maintained her vigil for 3 days, and each passing hour brought fresh horrors that carved themselves deeper into her conscience. She had taken to returning to her human form only in the pre-dawn darkness, apparating to her own cottage to wash, to eat mechanically through meals that tasted like ash, to stare at herself in the mirror and wonder when she had become complicit in the systematic destruction of a child. Then, before the sun could fully rise, she would return to Privet Drive, transform back into her tabby form, and resume her documentation of what could only be called torture disguised as domesticity. The routine at number 4 was as predictable as it was appalling. Harry, she forced herself to use his name, to remember that the skeletal child was a person, not the freak the Dursleys called him, was awakened before dawn each day by Vernon's shouting. The man had a particular way of banging on the cupboard door that made McGonagall's enhanced feline hearing ring with sympathetic pain. The locks would rattle, the hinges would protest, and then Harry would emerge, blinking in the harsh kitchen light like a creature unused to illumination. His breakfast, when it could be called that, consisted of whatever scraps remained from Dudley's enormous portions. Yesterday, it had been a single piece of toast, scraped clean of butter. The day before, half a glass of orange juice and nothing else. This morning, McGonagall watched in sick fascination as Petunia placed a bowl on the floor, actually on the floor, as if Harry were a dog, containing what appeared to be leftover porridge that had hardened overnight. "Eat quickly," Petunia had snapped, her horse-like face twisted in distaste. "You've got the entire back garden to weed today, and Vernon wants those rose bushes pruned. Properly this time, not like last week's disaster." McGonagall had no memory of any disaster with the rose bushes. They appeared immaculate to her eye, trimmed with the sort of precision that spoke of desperate attention to detail. But Harry had simply nodded, spooning the congealed porridge into his mouth with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had learned not to taste what he was eating. The work assignments were clearly designed to break him. Yesterday's task, moving an entire pile of bricks from one side of the garden to the other, by hand in the blazing heat, had taken Harry from dawn until nearly sunset. Today's pruning required him to reach high branches while standing on a rickety stepladder that wobbled dangerously with each movement. McGonagall watched his thin arms shake with exhaustion as he tried to maintain his balance, the pruning shears heavy in his small hands. But it was the conversations she overheard that truly revealed the systematic nature of the abuse. The freak's getting too comfortable. Vernon had grumbled to Petunia on the second evening, his voice carrying clearly through the kitchen window as McGonagall crouched in her hiding spot. "Did you see how he looked at Dudley's ice cream yesterday, getting ideas above his station?" "We can't have that," Petunia had agreed, her tone matter-of-fact, as if they were discussing the weather. "Perhaps we should skip his dinner tonight. Remind him of his place." "Already done," Vernon had replied with satisfaction. "Locked him up straight after the garden work. Little freak needs to learn that he gets fed when he earns it, not before." McGonagall had waited until well past midnight, hoping to see some sign that they had relented, that basic human decency had prevailed. But the cupboard door remained locked, and the house had settled into silence, broken only by Dudley's television programs echoing from upstairs. On the third day, she witnessed something that made her question everything she had ever believed about Albus Dumbledore's judgment. Harry had been tasked with cleaning the exterior windows, all of them, including the upstairs ones that required him to drag the stepladder around the house's perimeter. McGonagall watched him work with the methodical determination of someone who knew that any mistake would bring punishment. His thin frame moved carefully, precisely, as he scrubbed each pane of glass until it gleamed. It was when he was cleaning the kitchen window that disaster struck. The stepladder, old and unstable, gave way beneath him. Harry tumbled to the ground with a cry of pain, landing hard on his left arm. McGonagall started forward instinctively before forcing herself to remain hidden. Surely now, with the child clearly injured, some basic parental instinct would surface. Vernon had emerged from the house like a storm cloud, his face already purple with rage before he had even assessed what had happened. "What did you do, you clumsy freak?" he had bellowed, standing over Harry's prone form without offering so much as a hand up. "Look at this mess. Ladder's probably broken now, and all because you can't manage a simple task without making a production of it." Harry had struggled to his feet, cradling his injured arm against his chest. McGonagall could see from her position that something was wrong with the way the limb hung, but Harry made no sound of complaint. "I'm sorry, Uncle Vernon," he had whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll be more careful." "You'll be more careful, all right," Vernon had snarled. "You'll spend the rest of the day thinking about how to be more careful, in your room, without dinner." The cupboard door had slammed shut once again, those damned padlocks clicking into place with finality. McGonagall had heard no sound from within, no crying, no complaints, nothing that might indicate a child processing pain and fear in a normal, healthy way. Just silence that spoke of lessons learned too well and too young. That evening, as McGonagall finally allowed herself to retreat to her cottage, she found herself sitting in her study, staring at a photograph that had sat on her mantelpiece for 11 years. It showed Lily and James Potter on their wedding day, young and radiant, and utterly convinced that the world held nothing but joy for them. Lily's green eyes, Harry's green eyes, sparkled with laughter. What would Lily think if she could see her son now? What would she say about the blood protection that was supposed to keep him safe while he slowly starved in a cupboard under the stairs? McGonagall had spent 30 years trusting Albus Dumbledore's wisdom without question. He was the most powerful wizard of their age, a man whose strategic mind had guided them through a war and whose compassion was legendary. When he had insisted that Harry would be safest with the Dursleys, she had swallowed her objections. When he had spoken of blood magic and ancient protections, she had accepted his expertise in areas of magic far beyond her own understanding. But now, sitting in the lamplight of her study, with the taste of 3 days' worth of horror coating her tongue like poison, she found herself asking questions that should have been asked 10 years ago. What protection could possibly require a child to be starved? What ancient magic was served by locking an 11-year-old boy in a cupboard like a prisoner? What blood ward was strengthened by forcing Harry to sleep on what appeared to be little more than a collection of old blankets in a space too small for a grown person to lie down comfortably? She thought of Dumbledore's words from that long-ago November night. The boy will be safe here. Safer than anywhere else in the wizarding world. Safe from Voldemort's followers, perhaps. Safe from Death Eaters seeking revenge. But not safe from the very people who were supposed to protect him. The worst part, the detail that had been gnawing at her for 3 sleepless nights, was the evidence that this had been going on for years. Harry's behavior spoke of someone who had learned these routines through repetition, who knew exactly how to minimize attention and avoid additional punishment. The way he instinctively ducked when Vernon raised his voice. The speed with which he could make himself small and invisible. The fact that he never asked for anything. Not water during his long hours of labor. Not food when meals were skipped. Not medical attention when he was clearly hurt. This was not recent neglect. This was a child who had been systematically broken down over years, taught that his needs were irrelevant, and his very existence was a burden to be tolerated, rather than a life to be cherished. And somewhere in London, Albus Dumbledore sat in his office at Hogwarts, surrounded by his books and his instruments and his phoenix, believing, or perhaps simply telling himself, that all was well with the boy who lived. McGonagall rose from her chair and walked to her fireplace, where a small silver instrument sat on the mantel, a communication device keyed to Dumbledore's office, to be used only in the most dire emergencies. She reached for it, then stopped, her hand hovering inches from the metal. What would she say? That her fears from 10 years ago had proven correct? That the child they had all celebrated as their savior was being systematically destroyed by the very people entrusted with his care? That perhaps, just perhaps, Dumbledore's grand plan had a flaw that was costing Harry Potter his childhood, his health, and possibly his sanity. Her hand fell to her side. Not yet. Not until she knew exactly how deep this went, and not until she had proof that even Dumbledore could not dismiss. She would give it 3 more days. 1 week total of careful observation and documentation. And then, regardless of the consequences to her position or her relationship with the man she had served faithfully for decades, she would act. Because somewhere in a cupboard in Little Whinging, Harry Potter was learning that the wizarding world that had made him a symbol had also made him a sacrifice. And Minerva McGonagall would be damned if she let that sacrifice continue 1 day longer than absolutely necessary. The photograph of Lily and James seemed to watch her as she extinguished the lamps and made her way to bed. Their eyes holding an accusation she wasn't sure she could bear much longer. Chapter 3. Allies in Shadows. Minerva McGonagall stood outside the small, cluttered house on Wisteria Walk, her hands trembling as she raised them to knock. A week of surveillance had armed her with horrifying evidence, but it had also taught her something equally disturbing. She could not do this alone. Dumbledore's influence ran too deep, his authority too absolute. If she was going to save Harry Potter, she would need allies, people who had seen what she had seen, felt what she was feeling, and possessed the courage to act against the wizard they had all served without question. Arabella Figg answered the door on the second knock, her lined face creased with surprise. "Professor McGonagall, what brings you to Little Whinging?" Then, as understanding dawned in her eyes, her expression shifted to something that might have been relief. "Oh, you've seen him, haven't you?" The words hit McGonagall like a physical blow. Not seen what, or seen who. Simply acknowledgement that there was something to be seen, something that had been waiting to be discovered by someone with eyes willing to look. "May I come in?" McGonagall managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Mrs. Figg's sitting room was a testament to a life spent watching and waiting. Newspapers stacked in neat piles, a pair of binoculars resting on the windowsill that faced toward Privet Drive, and a small notebook that she hastily covered with a tea towel when she noticed McGonagall's gaze. The gesture was telling in its defensiveness. "Tea?" Mrs. Figg offered, her hands busy with the ritual, as if movement could somehow make this conversation less dangerous. Arabella, McGonagall said quietly, using the other woman's given name deliberately. How long have you known? Mrs. Figg's hands stilled on the tea service. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of an ancient grandfather clock in the corner. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Since the beginning, she admitted, not meeting McGonagall's eyes. Or close enough to it. The boy was barely walking when I first saw Vernon Dursley drag him back into the house by his arm for the crime of trying to follow Dudley into the garden. I told myself it was just rough handling, that perhaps Muggle child rearing was different from what I was used to. But it wasn't just rough handling, McGonagall said. It wasn't a question. No. Mrs. Figg sank into her chair as if the admission had cost her years. By the time he was 3, he was doing chores that Dudley couldn't manage at 6. By 4, he was sleeping in that bloody cupboard every night, while Dudley had a room the size of my entire ground floor. I started keeping notes. She gestured toward the covered notebook, telling myself I was documenting his development for my reports to Professor Dumbledore. And what did Dumbledore say when you reported the abuse? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither woman wanted to voice. Mrs. Figg's face crumpled, and suddenly she looked every one of her 70-odd years. He said the boy was safe, she whispered. He said that as long as Harry could call Privet Drive home, as long as he lived with blood relatives who had taken him in, the protection would hold. He said that some discomfort was a small price to pay for security from dark wizards who would kill the child without hesitation. Discomfort, McGonagall repeated flatly. You called 10-year-old boy being starved and locked in a cupboard discomfort in your reports. I called it what he wanted me to call it. Mrs. Figg snapped, some of her old spirit flaring. Do you think I enjoyed watching that child fade away year by year? Do you think I liked lying awake at night knowing he was hungry while that whale of a cousin got second helpings of everything? I am a squib, Professor McGonagall. My magical abilities extend to talking to cats and little else. Dumbledore made it very clear that my job was to watch and report, not to interfere. And when my reports became detailed, he suggested I focus on broader patterns rather than daily incidents. The euphemism was sickening in its implications. McGonagall found herself gripping the arms of her chair to keep from shaking with rage. How detailed were these reports before he asked you to refocus? Mrs. Figg retrieved the notebook from beneath its tea towel with hands that shook slightly. She opened it to a page near the beginning, her finger tracing entries written in a careful, precise script. August 15th, 1983, she read aloud. Harry, age 3 years, 1 month, locked in cupboard from approximately 6 p.m. until the following morning, for accidentally stepping on Aunt Petunia's flowers while chasing a butterfly. No evening meal provided. Cried for approximately 2 hours before falling silent. September 3rd, 1983. First day of nursery school for Dudley. Harry forced to clean entire kitchen floor with scrub brush while family celebrated. Punishment for asking if he would also attend school. Completed task on hands and knees. Took approximately 4 hours. McGonagall felt bile rising in her throat. And Dumbledore read these reports? Every word. At first he would ask clarifying questions. How often was Harry punished? What were the triggers? How did he respond to isolation? I thought. Mrs. Figg's voice broke slightly. I thought he was gathering evidence to intervene. But then his responses became shorter. Thank you for your diligence, Arabella. Continue your excellent work. And finally, perhaps focus on the boy's overall health and magical development rather than domestic details. Domestic details, McGonagall said, the words tasting like poison. Child abuse became domestic details. I kept writing the real reports, Mrs. Figg said quickly, as if the admission might somehow absolve her of 10 years of complicity. I have notebooks full of everything I've seen, but I sent him summaries, sanitized versions that mentioned Harry was adjusting well and showed no signs of magical distress. McGonagall stared at the woman across from her, seeing not an ally, but another victim of Dumbledore's manipulation. Arabella Figg had been placed in an impossible position. Watch a child be destroyed, or lose her only connection to the magical world that defined her identity. And Dumbledore had used that vulnerability to ensure Harry's suffering remained hidden. "Arabella," McGonagall said carefully, "I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you may cost us both our positions in the Order, and possibly our freedom if Dumbledore decides we're acting against the greater good. But I cannot stand by while Harry Potter is tortured in the name of protection. Will you help me?" Mrs. Figg met her eyes for the first time since McGonagall had arrived. "What do you need me to do?" 2 hours later, McGonagall stood in the shadows of a London alley, waiting for Remus Lupin to answer her urgent summons. She had chosen the location carefully, far from Diagon Alley's crowds, and nowhere near any place Dumbledore might have eyes or ears. When Lupin appeared with a soft pop of apparition, his worn robes and lined face spoke of a man who had aged poorly in the decade since his friends' deaths. "Minerva?" His voice carried surprise tinged with concern. "Your message said it was urgent. Is everything all right at Hogwarts?" "Walk with me," McGonagall said, instead of answering. She led him deeper into the alley, past abandoned shop fronts and rubbish bins, until they were well out of earshot of even the most dedicated eavesdropper. Only then did she turn to face him. "Remus, when did you last see Harry Potter?" The question clearly wasn't what he had expected. He blinked, his expression shifting from concern to something that might have been guilt. What do you mean?" "It's a simple question. When did you last lay eyes on James and Lily's son?" "I haven't," he admitted, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. Not since that night 10 years ago, when Hagrid brought him to Privet Drive." "Why?" "You know why." There was something defensive in his tone now, and he wouldn't meet her eyes. "Dumbledore felt it was safer if Harry grew up away from our world until he was old enough for Hogwarts. Too many people looking for revenge. Too many who might try to use him for their own purposes." "That's what Dumbledore told you," McGonagall said. It wasn't a question. "But what did you want to do?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of London traffic. When Lupin finally spoke, his words came out in a rush, as if they had been building pressure behind a dam for years. "I wanted to see him every day," he confessed. "I wanted to know if he had James's terrible habit of making his hair stick up, or Lily's way of tilting her head when she was thinking. I wanted to teach him to fly, to tell him stories about his parents, to make sure he knew how much they loved him. I asked Dumbledore, begged him, really, to let me visit. Just once a year, maybe at Christmas or on Harry's birthday. He said it would be too dangerous, that my condition made me a liability." "Your condition?" McGonagall repeated. "He used your lycanthropy to keep you away from your best friend's son." "He wasn't wrong," Lupin said quickly, though there was no conviction in the words. "I am dangerous, and if the Ministry knew I had contact with Harry Potter—" "Remus," McGonagall's voice was sharp enough to cut through his self-recrimination. "What if I told you that Harry Potter is in immediate danger? Not from Death Eaters or revenge-seekers, but from the very people Dumbledore placed him with." The colour drained from Lupin's face. "What do you mean?" McGonagall told him. Not everything, not the full horrifying catalogue of abuse she had witnessed, but enough. She watched as the man who had once been the most level-headed of the marauders processed the information that his friend's son had been systematically brutalized for a decade while he had honored Dumbledore's request to stay away. No, Lupin said finally, shaking his head. No, Dumbledore would never allow that. He loved James and Lily. He would, McGonagall interrupted. And he has. The question is what you're going to do about it. When she left Lupin an hour later, his face was set with a determination she hadn't seen since their Hogwarts days. He had promised to make discreet inquiries among other Order members to see who else might have tried to check on Harry and been discouraged. The third conversation was the most dangerous, and McGonagall saved it for last. She found Severus Snape in his private potions laboratory, surrounded by bubbling cauldrons and the overwhelming scent of preserved ingredients. He looked up from his work with his usual expression of barely concealed irritation. "Professor McGonagall, to what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" "I want to talk about Harry Potter." The change in Snape's demeanor was instantaneous. His black eyes sharpened, and his hand stilled on the potion he had been stirring. What about Potter's brat? The casual cruelty in his tone made McGonagall want to hex him on the spot, but she forced herself to remain calm. If her suspicions were correct, Snape's hostility was a facade covering something much more complex. "I think you've tried to check on him," she said simply. "I think Dumbledore stopped you." For a long moment, Snape said nothing. Then, very carefully, he set down his stirring rod and turned to face her fully. "What makes you think I would have any interest in Potter's spawn?" "Because he's Lily's son," McGonagall said quietly. "And despite everything you say about James Potter, you loved her. You wouldn't let her child suffer if you could prevent it." Something flickered across Snape's face. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its venom. 3 years ago, he said finally, I asked Dumbledore for permission to verify the boy's well-being. I told him I was concerned about magical development in a non-magical household, that untrained children sometimes experienced dangerous surges of accidental magic. What did he say? That my concern was noted but unnecessary, that the boy was thriving in a stable, loving environment, and that any intervention from the wizarding world, particularly from a former Death Eater, would be unwelcome and potentially harmful. McGonagall felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. He blocked you too. He blocked everyone, Snape said, his voice hollow with realization. Anyone who tried to get close to the boy, anyone who asked questions. We all assumed the others had access, that someone was ensuring his welfare. But no one was. No one, except that squib woman, and even she was kept at arm's length. The three of them met that evening in the back room of a dingy pub in Knockturn Alley, a place where order business was never conducted, and Dumbledore's spies were unlikely to venture. Mrs. Figg clutched her notebook like a lifeline, while Lupin stared into his untouched pint with hollow eyes. Snape sat apart from the others, his expression unreadable but his attention absolute. So we are agreed, McGonagall said quietly. Dumbledore has systematically prevented anyone from checking on Harry's welfare while receiving reports that documented ongoing abuse. The question now is whether we are prepared to act independently of his authority. He's the leader of the Order, Lupin said uncertainly. He's guided us through one war and prepared us for another. Surely there's some larger plan we don't understand. The larger plan, Snape interrupted, his voice cutting through Lupin's protests like a blade, appears to involve allowing a child to be tortured for a decade in the name of blood protection. Tell me, Lupin, what strategic purpose is served by keeping Potter weak and isolated? What tactical advantage do we gain by ensuring he has no allies, no training, and no reason to trust the wizarding world that supposedly reveres him? The question hung in the air, unanswered, because there was no answer that didn't make them all complicit in something monstrous. We extract him, McGonagall said finally. We document everything. We gather evidence that even Dumbledore cannot dismiss, and we present him with an ultimatum. Remove Harry from that house, or we will. And if he refuses? Mrs. Figg asked. McGonagall met each of their gazes in turn, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. Then we do it anyway. Chapter 4. Confronting Dumbledore. Minerva. McGonagall had walked the corridors of Hogwarts for over 3 decades, but she had never felt less welcome in a place she called home than she did climbing the spiral staircase to the headmaster's office. In her hands, she carried a manila folder containing photographs that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life, images captured with a Muggle camera during her week of surveillance, developed in perfect, damning clarity. Harry Potter, age 10, collapsed from heat exhaustion in a garden. Harry Potter, visible through a kitchen window, eating scraps off the floor like an animal. Harry Potter, dragged unconscious into a cupboard that any reasonable person would call a cell. The gargoyle moved aside without her speaking the password, a courtesy extended to the deputy headmistress that felt like mockery now. Dumbledore was waiting for her, seated behind his ornate desk with his hands folded calmly before him. Forks preened on his perch, and the silver instruments hummed their mysterious melodies, creating an atmosphere of serene wisdom that made McGonagall's stomach turn. "Ah, Minerva," Dumbledore said, his blue eyes twinkling behind half-moon spectacles. "I wondered when you might come to see me." "Tea?" The casual greeting, as if she were making a social call rather than confronting him with evidence of systematic child abuse, nearly shattered her composure before she could speak. "No tea," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Albus, we need to talk about Harry Potter." "Of course." Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, his expression one of mild interest. "I trust the boy as well. His Hogwarts letter will be delivered in a few weeks, and I'm quite looking forward to having him join us." McGonagall placed the folder on his desk with deliberate care, then opened it to reveal the first photograph. Dumbledore's gaze dropped to the image of Harry's skeletal frame, and for a moment something flickered across his features, too quick to interpret, gone before she could name it. "This," McGonagall said quietly, "is how Harry Potter looks after 10 years of your protection." Dumbledore studied the photograph with the same academic interest he might show a particularly complex piece of magic. When he looked up, his expression remained maddeningly calm. "The boy appears thin," he acknowledged. "Children often go through phases of growth that—" "Thin?" McGonagall's voice cracked like a whip. "Albus, this child is starving. Look at his arms, his face. Look at the way his clothes hang off him. This isn't a growth phase. This is malnutrition." She turned to the next photograph, and the next, laying them out like evidence in a trial. Harry working in scorching heat while his cousin lounged by a pool. Harry eating off the floor while the Dursleys sat at their table. Harry's small form crumpled on the ground, ignored by the adults who were supposed to care for him. "And this," McGonagall said, producing the final image, the one that had taken all her courage to capture. It showed the exterior of the cupboard under the stairs, with its industrial padlocks clearly visible. "This is where Harry Potter sleeps. Not in a bedroom, not even in a proper bed. In a cupboard. Locked in like a prisoner." Dumbledore examined each photograph with the same detached interest, occasionally adjusting his spectacles for a closer look. When he had seen them all, he gathered them into a neat stack and handed them back to her. "I see," he said simply. The response was so inadequate, so utterly insufficient, that McGonagall felt her world tilt on its axis. "You see?" she repeated. "Albus, these photographs document systematic abuse of a child. Harry Potter is being tortured by the people you placed him with, and your response is, 'I see?' The boy is alive and protected, Minerva," Dumbledore said, his tone taking on the patient quality he used when explaining complex magic to slower students. "That is what matters. The blood protection afforded by his aunt's sacrifice keeps him safe from far worse fates than temporary discomfort." Temporary discomfort. McGonagall felt something cold and final settle in her chest. 10 years of starvation and isolation is temporary discomfort. In the context of a life that may span a century or more, yes. Dumbledore's blue eyes were steady, untroubled. Harry's current circumstances are regrettable, but they serve a greater purpose. The protection keeping him alive requires that he be able to call Privet Drive home, that he remain with blood relatives who have accepted responsibility for his care. McGonagall stared at the man she had served faithfully for 3 decades, searching for some sign that he understood the magnitude of what he was dismissing. Are you telling me that this protection requires Harry to be abused? That ancient magic is somehow strengthened by locking a child in a cupboard? Not strengthened, Dumbledore corrected gently. But the protection does require that he remain with Petunia Dursley, regardless of her parenting methods. And I must say, Minerva, that while the Dursleys' approach may seem harsh to our eyes, it has produced the desired result. The desired result? McGonagall's voice rose, despite her efforts to remain calm. What exactly is the desired result of systematically breaking down a child's spirit? Dumbledore rose from his chair and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the grounds. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press against McGonagall's chest. Harry Potter was born into circumstances that marked him as a symbol before he could even walk, Dumbledore said. The wizarding world sees him as their savior, their hope, their rallying point. That kind of adoration can be corrupting. It can produce arrogance, entitlement, a sense that the rules apply to everyone except oneself. Understanding dawned on McGonagall like a physical blow. You wanted him to suffer. I wanted him to understand suffering, Dumbledore corrected, turning to face her. I wanted him to know what it means to be powerless, to be overlooked, to be treated as less than others. When the time comes for him to make the choices that will determine the fate of our world, I need him to make those choices from a place of humility rather than pride. You wanted him malleable, McGonagall said, the word tasting like poison. I wanted him to be willing to sacrifice, Dumbledore replied without hesitation. A boy raised in comfort and adoration might hesitate when asked to give up everything for others. A boy who has known hardship will understand that some things are more important than personal happiness. The casual admission hung between them like a curse. McGonagall felt 30 years of trust and respect crumble to dust in her chest. You've been reading Arabella's reports, she said numbly. You've known exactly what was happening to him. Of course. Dumbledore returned to his desk, settling back into his chair with the air of a man discussing the weather. Mrs. Figg's reports have been most thorough. I must admit, I was concerned in the early years that the Dursleys might be too lenient, but they have exceeded my expectations. Exceeded your expectations, McGonagall repeated, in torturing a child. In preparing him for his destiny, Dumbledore corrected. Minerva, I understand this is difficult to hear, but we are not dealing with an ordinary child. Harry Potter is the focal point of prophecy, the weapon that may be our only hope against the darkness that will inevitably return. I cannot allow sentiment to cloud my judgment where such vital matters are concerned. McGonagall stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time the cold calculation that had always lurked beneath his grandfatherly facade. You speak of him as if he's not human, as if he's a tool to be shaped rather than a child to be protected. In many ways that is exactly what he is, Dumbledore said with devastating honesty. The boy who lived, Minerva. Not the boy who was loved, or the boy who was happy, or the boy who had a normal childhood. The boy who lived. And he will continue to live precisely because I have ensured he understands that life is something to be preserved through suffering, not something to be enjoyed in comfort. The words hit McGonagall like physical blows, each one driving home the reality that the man she had trusted with her life, with her students' lives, with the fate of their world, had spent 10 years systematically destroying a child's spirit in service of his grand design. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked quietly. "When did you decide that Harry Potter needed to be broken before he could be useful?" Dumbledore considered the question with the same academic interest he had shown the photographs. "The prophecy was quite specific about the nature of the power the Dark Lord knows not," he said finally. "Love, sacrifice, the willingness to die for others. These are not qualities that develop naturally in those who have never known loss. James and Lily's deaths provided the initial foundation, but 10 years of character building have ensured that Harry will possess the emotional framework necessary to make the ultimate sacrifice when it is required." "The ultimate sacrifice," McGonagall echoed. "You're preparing him to die." "I'm preparing him to choose death if that choice will save others," Dumbledore corrected. "There is a difference, though I admit it may be a subtle one." McGonagall rose from her chair on unsteady legs, the photographs clutched in hands that shook with suppressed rage. "You monster," she whispered. "You absolute monster." For the first time since she had entered the office, Dumbledore's expression showed something other than calm confidence. His blue eyes sharpened, and his voice took on a note of warning. "I would advise against allowing emotion to override reason, Minerva. What I have done for the greater good. Sometimes that requires difficult choices, choices that others might not understand or appreciate. But I will not allow personal sentiment to jeopardize everything we have worked for." "Personal sentiment," McGonagall repeated. "You call basic human decency personal sentiment." "I call the welfare of one child less important than the survival of thousands," Dumbledore replied. "And if you cannot see the logic in that calculation, then perhaps you are not the person I believed you to be." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Support his methods, or risk losing everything: her position, her influence, her ability to protect any of the children under her care. McGonagall looked at the photographs in her hands, at the evidence of a decade of systematic cruelty carried out under the banner of the greater good, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. For 30 years, she had followed Albus Dumbledore without question, trusting in his wisdom and his compassion. She had believed in him with the faith of a disciple. That faith died in his office on a summer evening, killed by his casual admission that he had orchestrated the torture of an innocent child because it served his purposes. "You're right," she said quietly, meeting his gaze with steel in her own. "I am not the person you believed me to be. I am not someone who can watch a child be destroyed and call it necessary. I am not someone who can sacrifice Harry Potter's humanity on the altar of your greater good." She turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at the man who had once been her mentor and her hero. "I trusted you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "For 3 decades, I believed you were everything good and wise about our world. I was wrong. Minerva," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying a note of genuine regret. "I hope you will reconsider this position. Harry's training is nearly complete, and I would hate for any interference to undo years of careful preparation." The words were spoken gently, but the threat was clear. "Stay in line, or face the consequences." McGonagall straightened her shoulders and gave him the smile she reserved for students who had disappointed her beyond redemption. "Albus," she said sweetly, "I hope you will understand when I tell you that your careful preparation ends tonight. Harry Potter is going to learn what it means to be protected rather than preserved. And if you attempt to interfere with that process, you will discover exactly how formidable an enemy you've made." She left him there, surrounded by his instruments and his phoenix, and his grand plans for reshaping a child into a weapon. Behind her, she heard the soft sound of Fawkes's distressed trill, and she wondered if even magical creatures could sense the evil that had taken root in the heart of the light. By the time she reached her office, McGonagall had made 3 decisions that would change everything. Harry Potter would be removed from Privet Drive within the week. Albus Dumbledore would not be informed until it was too late to stop them, and she would spend whatever years remained to her ensuring that no child would ever again be sacrificed for someone else's vision of the greater good. The war between them had begun. Chapter 5. The Rescue Plan. The ancient law books in the restricted section of the Hogwarts library had never seemed more precious to Minerva McGonagall than they did in the dim light of her private study. She had been reading for 6 hours straight, her eyes burning with strain as she searched through centuries of wizarding legal precedent for anything that might provide an alternative to Dumbledore's supposed authority over Harry Potter's placement. 3 days had passed since her confrontation with Dumbledore, and the headmaster had made no direct move against her, yet. But McGonagall could feel his attention like a weight on her shoulders, could sense his growing suspicion in the careful way he watched her during meals, in the pointed questions he asked about her summer plans. Time was running short, and Harry's 11th birthday was less than 3 weeks away. The knock at her door came at precisely 9 o'clock, as arranged. McGonagall's wards recognized the magical signatures of her conspirators and allowed them entry without challenge. Remus Lupin entered first, his worn robes and lined face speaking of sleepless nights spent in research. Behind him came Severus Snape, his black eyes sharp with the intensity that always marked him when he was working toward a goal. Arabella Figg brought up the rear, her usual nervous energy replaced by grim determination. "What have you found?" McGonagall asked without preamble, gesturing for them to take seats around her desk. Lupin pulled out a leather satchel stuffed with parchment. "I've been through every guardianship law enacted in the last 500 years, he said, spreading documents across the desk surface. "The good news is that Dumbledore's authority over Harry's placement isn't as absolute as we've been led to believe. The bad news is that challenging it will require proof of gross negligence or active harm to the child, which we have," Snape said dryly, nodding toward the folder of photographs that had become McGonagall's constant companion. "Though proving it in a way the Ministry will accept is another matter entirely." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Figg asked, her voice tight with worry. Snape's expression was grim. "Dumbledore sits on the Wizengamot and has personally appointed half the current department heads. Any formal challenge through Ministry channels will reach his ears long before it reaches a courtroom. He'll have time to prepare countermeasures, perhaps even move the boy to a location where we can't find him." McGonagall felt a chill of fear at the implications. "Then we bypass the Ministry entirely. What other options do we have?" "Goblin law," Lupin said quietly. "I've made discreet inquiries at Gringotts. The goblins maintain their own legal system for matters involving wizarding children and inheritance. If we can prove that Harry's current placement violates the terms of his parents' will or endangers his inheritance, they have the authority to intervene." "Do we know what James and Lily's will contained?" McGonagall asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. "Miss Simpist." Figg shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while Lupin's face grew even more haggard. "Dumbledore was the executor," Lupin admitted. "He never shared the contents with any of us. Said it was for security reasons, that too many people knowing the details could compromise Harry's safety." "Another convenient excuse," Snape muttered. "How many of his decisions have been justified by security concerns that conveniently prevented anyone from questioning his methods?" McGonagall pulled out a piece of parchment and began making notes. "Then our first priority is gaining access to the Potter family will. Surely the goblins maintain records independently of the Ministry." "They do," Lupin confirmed. "I've arranged a meeting for tomorrow evening with Griphook. He was James and Lily's account manager. He's agreed to discuss the matter, though he made it clear that any official action would require significant evidence of wrongdoing." "Which brings us to our second problem," Snape said, his tone carrying the particular edge it took on when he was about to deliver unpleasant news. "The blood protection," Dumbledore may be a manipulative bastard, but his claims about ancient magic aren't necessarily fabricated. If Harry truly is protected by his aunt's sacrifice, removing him from her household could leave him vulnerable to attacks we can't counter. McGonagall felt her heart sink. This had been her greatest fear, that Dumbledore's justifications might have some basis in magical reality, even if his methods were monstrous. "You've researched the matter?" "Extensively." Snape pulled out a thick tome bound in black leather. "Blood magic is my area of expertise, as you know. I've spent the last 3 days analyzing every recorded instance of protective sacrifice in magical history." He opened the book to a page marked with multiple scraps of parchment. "The sacrifice Lily Potter made for her son is indeed powerful magic, among the most potent protective enchantments ever recorded. But Dumbledore's interpretation of its requirements is selective." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Figg leaned forward, her usual deference to Snape's expertise overridden by desperate hope. "The protection requires that Harry be able to call some place home, but not specifically the Dursleys' home," Snape explained. "The magic recognizes emotional bonds, not legal guardianship. If Harry were to form genuine family connections elsewhere, the protection would transfer to that location." McGonagall felt the first spark of real hope she had experienced in days. "You're certain?" "As certain as one can be when dealing with magic this complex," Snape replied. "But there's more. The protection is strengthened by love and acceptance, not by suffering. Dumbledore's claim that abuse somehow enhances the magic is not only false, it's actively counterproductive. A child who feels genuinely loved and protected will carry stronger magical defenses than one who has been systematically broken down." The revelation hit McGonagall like a physical blow. Not only had Dumbledore orchestrated Harry's abuse for no magical reason, but his methods had actually weakened the very protections he claimed to be preserving. "That bastard!" Lupin whispered, his usual mild manner cracking to reveal the rage beneath. "He's been torturing Harry for nothing. Worse than nothing, he's been making him less safe." "Which gives us our legal argument," McGonagall said, her mind racing through possibilities. "If we can prove that Harry's current placement actually weakens his magical protections, the goblins will have grounds to intervene on the basis of inheritance preservation. Assuming they believe Snape's interpretation over Dumbledore's," Mrs. Figg pointed out. "The headmaster's reputation in magical theory is rather formidable." Snape's smile was sharp and unpleasant. "Then we provide them with a demonstration. Blood magic leaves traces, magical signatures that can be measured and analyzed. I can create an analytical potion that will reveal the current strength of Harry's protections. If my theory is correct, the readings will show significant degradation compared to what the magic should be capable of." McGonagall felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "And if we can show the goblins that Harry's protections are failing under his current circumstances, they'll have both legal authority and magical justification to intervene," Lupin finished. "The question then becomes where we take him, and how we keep him safe from Dumbledore's retaliation." This was the moment McGonagall had been dreading, the point where theory became action, where careful planning met the reality of directly defying the most powerful wizard of their age. "I have a cottage in the Scottish Highlands," she said slowly. "It's unplottable, warded against detection, and keyed only to my magical signature. I could modify the wards to accept Harry as a permanent resident." "That would make you his legal guardian under Scottish magical law," Lupin pointed out. "Are you prepared for that responsibility, Minerva?" The question hung in the air between them. McGonagall thought of Harry's thin face, of his careful movements designed to avoid attention, of the way he had eaten scraps off the floor without complaint. Then she thought of Lily Potter's green eyes, of the trust James and Lily had placed in their friends, of the child they had died to protect. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." Snape nodded approvingly. "The cottage will need additional protections. Dumbledore knows all of your usual wards. He helped design half of them during the war. I can create new defensive enchantments based on blood magic principles. If Harry truly accepts your home as his own, the protections will be formidable." "How long do you need?" McGonagall asked. 2 weeks to prepare the potions and ward modifications," Snape replied. "The timing works well. We can extract Harry on his birthday, when the magical transition to adulthood makes legal guardianship changes easier to implement." Mrs. Fig cleared her throat nervously. "What about his Hogwarts letter? If we take him before it's delivered—" "I'll handle the letter," McGonagall said firmly. "I know what it contains, and I can prepare Harry for the magical world properly, without Hagrid's theatrical dramatics or Dumbledore's manipulations." "There's one more consideration," Lupin said quietly. "Once we do this, there's no going back. Dumbledore will consider us traitors to everything he's worked for. He'll use every resource at his disposal to reclaim Harry and punish us for defying him." McGonagall met each of their gazes in turn, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. "Are you all prepared for that? For being branded enemies of Albus Dumbledore?" "I've been his enemy since the day he decided to let a child suffer for his grand design," Snape said coldly. "Making it official changes nothing." "James and Lily trusted me to protect their son," Lupin added, his voice strengthening with resolve. "I failed them for 10 years because I trusted Dumbledore's judgment over my own instincts. I won't fail them again." Mrs. Fig nodded firmly. "I've spent a decade writing sanitized reports while that boy was destroyed piece by piece. If helping to save him makes me a traitor, then I'll wear that label proudly." McGonagall felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of finally having allies who understood what they were fighting for. "Then we're agreed," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were planning. "On July 31st, we extract Harry Potter from Privet Drive. We give him the childhood he should have had, the protection he deserves, and the choice to determine his own future." She paused, thinking of the man who had been her mentor for 3 decades, who had shaped her understanding of right and wrong, who would never forgive what they were about to do. "And we hope," she added quietly, "that history will judge us more kindly than we're judging him." Outside her window, the summer night was peaceful and warm, but McGonagall could feel the gathering storm. In 3 weeks, the wizarding world would discover that Albus Dumbledore was not infallible, that his grand plans could be challenged, and that sometimes the greater good required protecting the innocent from those who claimed to serve it. The war for Harry Potter's soul was about to begin in earnest, and for the first time since this nightmare had started, McGonagall believed they might actually win. Chapter 6. The Extraction. The morning of July 31st dawned grey and drizzling, as if the sky itself understood the significance of what was about to unfold on Privet Drive. Minerva McGonagall stood at the end of the street, no longer hidden, no longer watching from the shadows. Today, she wore her human form like armor, her emerald robes pristine despite the weather, her pointed hat casting sharp shadows across her face. In her hand, she held a wand that had not tasted battle magic in 10 years. Today, that would change. The plan was precise, rehearsed, and designed to minimize Harry's trauma while maximizing the Dursleys' shock. Remus Lupin waited 3 streets away with emergency medical supplies and calming potions. Severus Snape maintained a discreet perimeter, ready to counter any magical interference from Dumbledore or his allies. Arabella Figg had positioned herself at her kitchen window with a camera, prepared to document whatever the Dursleys might do when confronted. McGonagall checked her watch. 7:30 a.m. In the original timeline, Harry's Hogwarts letter would have arrived at midnight, followed by Hagrid's dramatic entrance. Instead, McGonagall had intercepted the owl 3 streets away, redirecting the letter to her own office. The Dursleys had no idea their carefully constructed lie was about to crumble. She walked up the immaculate garden path of number 4 Privet Drive, noting the fresh coat of paint, the pristine roses, the gleaming windows, all maintained by a child's forced labor. When she reached the front door, she didn't knock. She placed her hand against the wood, whispered a simple unlocking charm, and stepped inside. The house was exactly as she remembered from her surveillance, aggressively normal, suffocatingly clean, and utterly devoid of warmth. From the kitchen came the sounds of breakfast, Vernon's grumbling about work, Petunia's sharp corrections to Dudley's table manners, the clatter of dishes being prepared for 3 people. 3, not 4. McGonagall's jaw tightened as she moved silently down the hallway toward the cupboard under the stairs. The padlocks were exactly where she had seen them through the window. Industrial grade, designed to keep something dangerous contained. Something, not someone. She placed her ear against the door and heard the soft sound of breathing, careful and controlled. Harry was awake, probably had been for hours, waiting for Vernon's morning, shouting to release him for another day of servitude. Not today. McGonagall raised her wand and whispered an unlocking charm. The padlock sprang open with sharp clicks that echoed like gunshots in the quiet hallway. She pulled the door open and stepped back, giving the occupant space to emerge. What crawled out of that cupboard would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Harry Potter at 11 was, if anything, thinner than he had been at 10. The month since her surveillance had not been kind to him. His cheekbones stood out sharply in a face that had never known baby fat, and his clothes hung off his frame like burial shrouds. But it was his eyes that broke McGonagall's heart. They held the wariness of an animal that had learned that survival meant never relaxing, never trusting, never hoping for kindness. When he saw her standing there, a strange woman in strange clothes with a wooden stick in her hand, he didn't run. He didn't call for help. He simply froze, his entire body going rigid with terror. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disuse. "I haven't done anything wrong. I've been good. I promise I've been good." The words hit McGonagall like physical blows. This child's first instinct upon seeing a stranger wasn't curiosity or confusion. It was to beg for mercy. "Harry," she said softly, crouching down to his eye level and keeping her wand carefully lowered. "My name is Professor McGonagall. I'm here to help you." His green eyes, Lily's eyes, so much like his mother's, darted between her face and the wand, and McGonagall saw the exact moment when terror shifted to desperate calculation. He was trying to figure out what she wanted, what he could do or say to avoid punishment. "I don't know any professor," he said carefully, as if the words might be a trap. "Are you from social services? Because Uncle Vernon says—" "What the bloody hell?" Vernon Dursley's bellow from the kitchen cut through Harry's words like a blade. The boy's reaction was instantaneous and heartbreaking. He dropped to the floor and curled into a ball, hands over his head, body shaking with the expectation of blows. McGonagall rose to her full height as Vernon thundered into the hallway, his face already purple with rage. Behind him came Petunia, her face white with panic, and Dudley, whose small, pig-like eyes widened with excitement at the prospect of drama. "Get out of my house!" Vernon roared, brandishing a cricket bat like a weapon. "I don't know who you think you are, but you have no right." "I have every right," McGonagall said, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years of teaching and the cold fury of a month spent watching child abuse. "I am here on behalf of Harry Potter's legal guardians." The lie was smooth and absolute. She had decided that Vernon Dursley deserved no explanations and fewer courtesies. Vernon's face went from purple to nearly black. "We are his legal guardians. We took him in when nobody else wanted the freak. We've fed him and housed him and—" "You have tortured him," McGonagall interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You have starved him, beaten him, and locked him in a cupboard like an animal. That ends today." "You can't prove anything," Petunia said, her voice high and thin with panic. "Harry is a difficult child. He requires firm discipline. We've done nothing that any reasonable parent wouldn't—" McGonagall raised her wand, and Vernon's cricket bat turned into a large snake that immediately began wrapping itself around his arm. His scream of terror echoed through the house, drowning out Petunia's shriek and Dudley's wails. The transformation served two purposes. It demonstrated beyond doubt that McGonagall was not someone to be trifled with, and it provided definitive proof of magic that would shatter any remaining delusions the Dursleys might harbour about Harry's nature. "Please," Harry whispered from his position on the floor. "Please don't hurt them because of me. I'll be good. I promise I'll be better. Just don't—" The words broke McGonagall's heart all over again. This child, after years of abuse, was trying to protect the people who had destroyed him. "Harry," she said gently, turning away from Vernon's continued struggles with the snake. "Listen to me very carefully. You have done nothing wrong. You are not being punished. These people have hurt you, and I am here to take you somewhere safe." Safe. The word came out cracked and uncertain, as if he didn't quite understand its meaning. "Safe," McGonagall confirmed. She cancelled the transformation spell, and Vernon's cricket bat clattered to the floor. "Harry, I'm going to ask you to pack your belongings. Anything that belongs to you, anything you want to keep." Harry's eyes darted toward the cupboard, then back to her face. "Everything I own is in there." McGonagall looked into the cramped space that had been this child's bedroom for 10 years, and felt her heart break again. A thin mattress on the floor, a single threadbare blanket, a small pile of clothes that looked like they had been Dudley's cast-offs, a few broken toys carefully hidden in the corner. "That's all?" she asked quietly. Harry nodded, his eyes never leaving her face, still searching for the catch, the trick, the moment when kindness would reveal itself as another form of cruelty. "You can't take him," Vernon wheezed, clutching his chest as if he were having a heart attack. "Whatever you are, wherever you're from, you can't just take a child. There are laws." "Yes," McGonagall agreed pleasantly. "There are laws against child abuse, laws against false imprisonment, laws against torture. Would you like me to contact the authorities, Mr. Dursley? I have extensive documentation of your violations." She pulled out the folder of photographs, and Vernon's face went white as he recognized some of the images. "You've been watching us," Petunia whispered. "You're some kind of stalker." "I'm someone who actually cares about Harry's welfare," McGonagall replied, "unlike the people who were supposed to protect him." She knelt down next to Harry again, moving slowly and keeping her voice gentle. "Harry, I need you to gather your things. We're going to leave here, and you're never coming back." "Where will I go?" The question was barely audible, filled with the terror of a child who had learned that change usually meant worse suffering. "With me," McGonagall said simply. "I have a house in Scotland. It's quiet and safe, and there are no cupboards under staircases. You'll have your own room, your own bed, and nobody will hurt you anymore." Harry stared at her for a long moment, and McGonagall could almost see him trying to process the concept of safety, of kindness without strings attached. When he finally moved, it was with the careful precision of someone who had learned that sudden movements brought punishment. He crawled back into the cupboard, and McGonagall had to swallow bile at the sight of an 11-year-old child having to crawl into his sleeping space, and emerged with a handful of possessions that would have embarrassed a beggar. Clothes that were more holes than fabric, a few broken toys, a pair of glasses held together with tape. "That's everything," he said, clutching his meagre belongings to his chest like they were treasure. McGonagall felt tears prick at her eyes. She reached into her robes and pulled out a small bag, enchanted with an extension charm, though Harry wouldn't understand that yet. "Put them in here," she said gently. "Everything will be safe." As Harry carefully placed his possessions in the bag, McGonagall turned her attention back to the Dursleys, who had huddled together near the kitchen door like the cowards they were. "Let me be very clear," she said, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority and fury. "If you attempt to contact Harry, if you try to reclaim him, if you even think about interfering with his new life, I will return. And next time, I will not be nearly so restrained." Vernon opened his mouth to bluster, but McGonagall silenced him with a look that could have frozen fire. "You will tell anyone who asks that Harry has gone to live with relatives in Scotland. You will not speak of magic. You will not speak of what happened here today. And you will never again refer to any child as a freak. Do I make myself clear?" The three Dursleys nodded frantically, and McGonagall felt a savage satisfaction at their terror. They had spent 10 years terrorizing a helpless child. It was time they learned what fear felt like from the other side. "Harry," she said, turning back to the boy who stood clutching his bag with white knuckles. "Are you ready?" He looked around the hallway that had been his prison for as long as he could remember, then back at her face. When he spoke, his voice was stronger than it had been since she'd first found him. "Yes," he said. "I'm ready." McGonagall held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Harry took it. His fingers were thin and cold, but they held on tightly as she led him toward the front door. "Wait," he said suddenly, stopping just before the threshold. "What about school? What about—" "I'll explain everything," McGonagall promised. "But not here. Never here again." They stepped out into the grey morning light, and McGonagall felt Harry's hand tighten in hers as he took his first steps into freedom. Behind them, Number 4 Privet Drive stood silent and still. No longer a home, but a monument to cruelty that had finally been overcome. As they walked away from the house, where Harry Potter had spent the worst years of his life, McGonagall made a silent promise to Lily and James Potter. Their son would never again know hunger or fear or the sound of locks clicking shut on his hopes for safety. The rescue was complete. Now the real work could begin. Chapter 7. Safe Harbour. The cottage materialized around them with a soft pop that made Harry stumble, his hand tightening reflexively on McGonagall's. For a moment, he simply stood there, blinking in confusion as his eyes adjusted to the warm lamplight that filled the small entryway. The smell hit him first, not the harsh chemical cleaners of Privet Drive, but something softer. Lavender, perhaps, and the lingering scent of baking bread. "Welcome home, Harry," McGonagall said quietly, watching his face with careful attention. Home. The word felt foreign on his tongue, like a language he had never learned to speak. Harry's eyes darted around the space, cataloguing exits, hiding places, potential dangers with the automatic precision of someone who had learned that survival depended on constant vigilance. The cottage was small but warm, with stone walls that seemed to radiate comfort rather than confinement. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows that should have been threatening but somehow weren't. Books lined the walls, more books than Harry had ever seen in one place, their spines worn with use rather than neglect. "It's very—" Harry started, then stopped, unsure what he was allowed to say. At Privet Drive, opinions were dangerous things that led to punishment. "It's nice," he finished carefully. McGonagall's expression softened at his obvious caution. "You can speak freely here, Harry. Whatever you think, whatever you feel, none of it will get you in trouble." The concept was so foreign that Harry simply stared at her, unable to process the idea that his thoughts might be welcome rather than punishable. At Privet Drive, even thinking too loudly seemed to draw Vernon's wrath. "Are you hungry?" McGonagall asked gently. "I imagine you haven't eaten much today." Harry's stomach chose that moment to emit a growl so loud it seemed to echo in the quiet cottage. He flushed with embarrassment, wrapping his arms around his middle as if he could silence the betraying sound. "Sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to—" "Harry," McGonagall's voice was firm but kind. "You never need to apologize for being hungry, or tired, or confused, or anything else you might feel. Those are normal human needs, not inconveniences." She led him toward what appeared to be a kitchen, and Harry followed with the careful steps of someone who had learned that sudden movements brought attention, and attention brought pain. The kitchen was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Warm yellow walls lined with copper pots, a large wooden table surrounded by mismatched chairs, windows that looked out onto a garden where twilight was settling like a gentle blanket. "Sit," McGonagall instructed, pulling out a chair at the table. Harry remained standing, his eyes fixed on the chair as if it might be a trap. At Privet Drive, he ate standing up when he ate at all, usually hunched over the sink while the Dursleys finished their meal at the table. Chairs were for real people, not for freaks. McGonagall seemed to understand his hesitation without explanation. "The chair is yours, Harry. Everything in this house is yours to use as you need it." Slowly, carefully, Harry lowered himself onto the chair. The cushion was soft beneath him, softer than his thin mattress had been, and for a moment the unexpected comfort was almost overwhelming. He perched on the edge, ready to leap up at the first sign that he had made a mistake. McGonagall moved around the kitchen with efficient grace, and Harry watched her every movement with the intensity of a cat watching a potential threat. She pulled ingredients from cupboards, lit the stove with a casual wave of her hand. Magic, Harry realized with a start, though somehow it seemed less frightening when it was being used to prepare food rather than to terrorize his relatives. "Professor McGonagall," Harry said quietly, then stopped. He had never been allowed to ask questions at Privet Drive, and the habit of silence was hard to break. "What is it, Harry? And please, when we're here, you can call me Minerva, if you'd like." The offer of informality was so unexpected that Harry nearly fell off his chair. Adults didn't invite children to use their first names. Adults were authority figures who demanded respect and distance, and never, ever familiarity. "I don't understand what's happening," he admitted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "The magic, and leaving the Dursleys, and—" He gestured helplessly around the kitchen. "This. Why are you helping me?" McGonagall paused in her cooking, her hands stilling on the wooden spoon she had been using to stir something that smelled better than anything Harry had ever encountered. "Because you're a child who deserves to be safe and cared for," she said simply. "Because what the Dursleys did to you was wrong, and someone needed to stop it. And because—" She turned to face him fully, her eyes soft with an emotion Harry couldn't name. "Because your parents were my friends, and they loved you more than life itself. They died protecting you, and I've failed them for 10 years by letting you suffer. I can't undo that failure, but I can make sure it never happens again." "My parents," Harry repeated softly. It was the first time anyone had ever told him his parents had died protecting him, rather than dying in a car crash while drunk. Were they really magic? Like you? "They were," McGonagall confirmed. "Your father could transform into a stag, and your mother had a gift for protective magic that saved your life the night they died. And you, Harry, are one of the most famous young wizards in our world." Famous, the word sent a spike of fear through Harry's chest. At Privet Drive, attention meant punishment. Being noticed meant pain. McGonagall must have seen his distress, because she quickly added, "But here, in this cottage, you're not famous. You're not the boy who lived, or any other title people might give you. You're just Harry, and that's more than enough." She returned to her cooking, and Harry sat in stunned silence, trying to process the revelation that not only was magic real, but he was magical too. It explained so much. The strange things that happened around him when he was angry or scared, the way glass sometimes shattered when Vernon shouted at him, the time he had accidentally turned his teacher's hair blue. The smell of food grew stronger, and Harry's stomach clenched with hunger, so sharp it was almost painful. When was the last time he had eaten? Yesterday morning, perhaps. Vernon had been particularly angry about something at work, and had decided that Harry didn't deserve dinner. "Almost ready," McGonagall said cheerfully. "I hope you like shepherd's pie." She placed a plate in front of him that was so loaded with food, Harry stared at it in shock. The portion was enormous, more than he usually saw in 3 days combined. Steam rose from the golden crust, carrying scents that made his mouth water involuntarily. "There's more in the pot if you'd like seconds," McGonagall added casually, as if the idea of unlimited food was perfectly normal. Harry picked up his fork with trembling hands, then paused. This had to be a test of some kind. Adults didn't give children unlimited food without expecting something in return. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. McGonagall looked up from her own plate in confusion. "I'm sorry. For the food. What work do you want me to do, or what punishment?" Harry's voice trailed off as he saw the expression on McGonagall's face. Horror, followed by something that looked like rage. "Harry," she said very carefully, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "I don't want you to do anything. The food is yours because you're hungry, and children need to eat. There are no conditions, no work requirements, no punishments. You eat because you need food to live and grow, not because you've earned the right to survive." The concept was so foreign that Harry simply stared at her. Food without strings attached, kindness without payment. It was like being told that gravity worked upward or that water flowed backward. "Try it," McGonagall encouraged gently. "Please." Harry took a tentative bite, and the explosion of flavor on his tongue was almost overwhelming. It was warm and rich and filled with spices he couldn't name. It tasted like comfort, like care, like all the meals he had imagined while listening to the Dursleys eat through his cupboard door. He tried to eat slowly, to be polite, but the food was so good and he was so hungry that he found himself wolfing it down with desperate efficiency. He finished the entire plate in what felt like minutes, then sat back, feeling more full than he had in months. "Better?" McGonagall asked with a smile. Harry nodded, then froze as he realized what he had done. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I ate too fast. I know I'm supposed to have better manners, but I was just so hungry, and it tasted so good, and—" "Harry." McGonagall's voice cut through his panicked apology. "You have nothing to apologize for. You were hungry, so you ate. That's exactly what you should have done." She stood and moved to the stove, returning with the pot of shepherd's pie. "Would you like more?" Harry stared at the pot as if it might contain gold. "I'm allowed?" "Of course you're allowed. This is your home now, Harry. That means you eat when you're hungry, sleep when you're tired, and ask for what you need without fear of being refused." Tentatively, hardly daring to believe it was real, Harry held out his plate. McGonagall spooned another generous portion onto it, then added a dollop of something green that she identified as peas. As Harry ate his second helping with slightly more restraint, McGonagall began to speak about magic, not in the overwhelming way Hagrid would have done in the original timeline, but gently, carefully, like someone introducing a nervous animal to a new environment. "Magic is part of you, Harry," she explained. "It's been suppressed by your living situation and your emotional state. But it's there. As you heal, as you become stronger, your magic will grow stronger, too." "Is that why strange things always happened around me?" Harry asked between bites. "The Dursleys said I was a freak because of it." McGonagall's jaw tightened at the word freak, but her voice remained calm. "The Dursleys were wrong about many things. Magic isn't freakish, it's a gift. And the strange things that happened were your magic trying to protect you or express what you couldn't say with words." After dinner, McGonagall showed him to what she called his room. Harry stood in the doorway, unable to enter, staring at the space that was larger than his cupboard and the Dursleys' kitchen combined. There was a real bed with actual pillows, a wardrobe for clothes, a desk by the window, and shelves waiting for books and treasures. "It's mine," he whispered. "It's yours," McGonagall confirmed. "For as long as you want it." Harry stepped into the room cautiously, as if the floorboards might give way beneath his feet. He touched the bed lightly, marveling at the softness of the quilt, then quickly pulled his hand back. "I don't have pajamas," he said suddenly. "The Dursleys never. I just slept in my clothes." "We'll get you proper clothes tomorrow," McGonagall promised. For tonight, there are some things in the wardrobe that should fit well enough. She showed him the wardrobe, which contained soft cotton shirts and warm flannel trousers that looked like they had been waiting just for him. She showed him the bathroom across the hall, with its deep tub and fluffy towels and soap that smelled like lavender. "Would you like a bath?" she offered. "Hot water? Proper soap? As long as you like?" Harry's eyes went wide. Hot baths were Dudley's privilege. Harry got cold water once a week if he was lucky, and only then if Vernon remembered he existed. An hour later, Harry emerged from the bathroom, feeling cleaner than he had ever been in his life. The hot water had eased aches he hadn't known he was carrying, and the soap had washed away 10 years of grime and neglect. In the soft flannel pajamas, he felt almost human. McGonagall was waiting in the sitting room when he came downstairs, a mug of hot chocolate steaming on the table beside her chair. "For you," she said, gesturing to the mug. "A birthday gift." Harry had forgotten entirely that today was his birthday. At Privet Drive, birthdays were Dudley's celebration. Harry's were ignored entirely. "I've never had hot chocolate," he admitted, curling up in the chair across from hers and wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Then this is a night for many firsts," McGonagall said gently. As Harry sipped the sweet, rich drink, he felt something he had never experienced before, a loosening in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. For the first time in his life, he was safe, fed, warm, wanted. When McGonagall smiled at him, really smiled, with genuine fondness rather than obligation, Harry felt his face respond almost involuntarily. The corners of his mouth turned up, hesitant and rusty from disuse, but unmistakably real. It was his first genuine smile in 11 years, and it felt like coming home. Chapter 8. Dumbledore's Retaliation. Minerva McGonagall woke to the sound of her cottage's outer wards, screaming in alarm. The magical alerts cut through her sleep like broken glass, sharp and urgent, and filled with the kind of malevolent intent that made her blood freeze. She was on her feet and reaching for her wand before her eyes had fully opened, 30 years of war reflexes overriding the comfortable safety she had been cultivating. The clock beside her bed read 6:23 a.m. Harry had been with her for barely 36 hours. McGonagall pulled on her dressing gown and hurried down the hallway, pausing outside Harry's door to listen. She could hear him stirring inside, likely awakened by the same magical disturbance that had roused her. His sleep had been fitful since arriving, plagued by nightmares and the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that safety was always temporary. The ward screamed again, and this time McGonagall recognized the magical signature pressing against her defenses. Albus Dumbledore, and he was not alone. She reached the sitting room just as her front door exploded inward, torn from its hinges by magic so forceful it left scorch marks on the stone frame. Through the ruined doorway strode Dumbledore in all his terrible majesty. Not the grandfatherly headmaster who handed out sweets and twinkled at students, but the wizard who had led them through the darkest war in living memory. His blue eyes blazed with cold fury, and his magic crackled around him like a visible aura of power. Behind him came his reinforcements, Kingsley Shacklebolt, whose aura training was evident in his tactical positioning, Emmeline Vance, whose wand was already drawn and pointed toward the staircase, and Elphias Doge, whose ancient loyalty to Dumbledore had clearly overcome any qualms about breaking into a colleague's home. "Minerva," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You will return Harry Potter to his guardians immediately." McGonagall stepped into the center of her sitting room, her wand steady in her hand, despite the tremor of rage that ran through her entire body. "Those people are not his guardians, Albus. They are his torturers, and you know it." "I know that you have allowed sentiment to cloud your judgment," Dumbledore replied, his tone taking on the patient quality he used when explaining complex magic to particularly slow students. "I know that you have jeopardized years of careful planning for the sake of temporary comfort. and I know that Harry must be returned to Privet Drive before irreparable damage is done to the protections that keep him alive. The only irreparable damage was done by leaving him there in the first place, McGonagall snapped. I've seen the evidence, Albus. I've documented 10 years of systematic abuse. I know you've been receiving reports about his condition and choosing to ignore them. Dumbledore's expression remained maddeningly calm. Mrs. Figg's reports indicated that while Harry's circumstances were challenging, they were necessary for his ultimate development. The boy needed to understand suffering before he could appreciate sacrifice. The casual admission of orchestrated cruelty made McGonagall's vision blur with fury. Before she could respond, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Quick, light, and unmistakably terrified, Harry appeared in the doorway, wearing the soft pajamas she had given him, his green eyes wide with the particular terror of a child who had learned that loud voices and angry adults meant pain. He clutched a pillow to his chest like a shield, and McGonagall could see the way his thin frame trembled with barely controlled panic. "Professor," he whispered, his voice so small it barely carried across the room. "What's happening? Are they here to take me back?" The question hit the room like a physical blow. Even Kingsley shifted uncomfortably at the naked fear in the child's voice, while Emmeline lowered her wand slightly, as if suddenly uncertain about what she was pointing it at. Dumbledore, however, stepped forward with the same benevolent smile he might use when greeting a student in his office. "Hello, Harry. I am Albus Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. I've come to take you home." Harry's reaction was immediate and devastating. He dropped the pillow and pressed himself against the doorframe, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow as panic overtook him. McGonagall recognized the signs of what Muggles were beginning to call a panic attack, the psychological collapse of someone whose trauma responses had been triggered beyond his ability to cope. "No," Harry gasped, his hands clawing at the doorframe as if he could somehow anchor himself against being dragged away. "No, please. I haven't done anything wrong. I've been good. I promise I've been good. Please don't make me go back." McGonagall moved immediately, placing herself between Harry and the intruders, her wand raised, and her magic flaring with protective fury. "Get out!" she snarled. "Get out of my home before I forget that I once respected you." "Minerva," Dumbledore said gently, as if speaking to a hysterical child. "Look at what your interference has done to him. The boy is terrified, confused, unable to understand the necessity of his situation. This is exactly why he needed to remain with the Dursleys, to learn that life requires sacrifice, and that comfort is not always possible. He's terrified because you're threatening to send him back to people who tortured him for 10 years. McGonagall's voice rose to a shout that made the cottage's remaining windows rattle. He's confused because adults keep telling him that abuse is love and suffering is protection. Behind Dumbledore, his supporters were beginning to look uncertain. Kingsley's professional composure was cracking as he watched an 11-year-old child hyperventilate with terror at the prospect of being returned to his home. Emmeline had lowered her wand entirely, her face pale with dawning understanding. "Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice taking on the warm, grandfatherly tone that had charmed countless students over the decades. "You must understand that sometimes we must endure difficult circumstances for the greater good. Your aunt and uncle may seem harsh, but they have kept you safe from far worse dangers. The wizarding world is full of people who would hurt you if they knew where to find you." Harry's breathing was becoming more erratic, his face flushed with the effort of trying to process air through lungs that refused to work properly. McGonagall knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder while keeping her wand trained on Dumbledore. "Harry, breathe with me," she said softly. "In and out, slowly. You're safe. I won't let anyone take you anywhere you don't want to go." "But he said," Harry gasped, "he said I have to go back. He said it's for the greater good, and adults always know better." "And adults don't always know better," McGonagall said firmly, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. and no adult has the right to hurt you, no matter what they claim it's for." The words seemed to reach Harry through his panic. His breathing slowed slightly, though his eyes remained fixed on Dumbledore with the wariness of a cornered animal. It was at that moment that Severus Snape stepped through the ruined doorway, his black robes billowing around him like the wings of an avenging angel. Behind him came Remus Lupin, whose usually mild demeanor had been replaced by something fierce and protective that reminded McGonagall suddenly of the marauder he had once been. "Albus," Snape said, his voice carrying enough acid to strip paint. "How predictable. I wondered how long it would take you to discover that your carefully orchestrated child abuse had been interrupted." Dumbledore's benevolent mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Severus, I had hoped you might understand the complexities of the situation better than our colleagues. Surely you, of all people, understand that the greater good sometimes requires difficult choices. I understand that you are a manipulative old bastard who has spent 10 years torturing a child," Snape replied with deadly calm. "I understand that you have perverted the concept of protection into something unrecognizable. And I understand that if you attempt to take Potter back to that house, you will have to go through me." Lupin moved to flank Harry's other side, his wand drawn, but held low. "James and Lily died protecting their son," he said quietly. "They trusted him to our world's protection. We failed them once. We won't fail them again." The standoff stretched taut as a wire. 7 adults facing off over a terrified child who represented more than just one boy's welfare. He represented the soul of their entire world. Would they protect the innocent, or sacrifice them for abstract concepts of greater good? It was Harry who broke the silence. His voice was still shaky with residual panic, but there was something new in it. A small, fragile note of defiance that hadn't existed before his rescue. "I don't want to go back," he said, looking directly at Dumbledore. "They hurt me. Every day they hurt me. And if you make me go back, they'll hurt me more because I left. I don't care about the greater good. I don't want to be hurt any more." The simple declaration landed like a thunderbolt in the small cottage. An 11-year-old child, speaking truth to power, choosing his own welfare over abstract concepts he didn't understand and hadn't consented to serve. Dumbledore's face hardened at this unprecedented act of defiance. "Harry, you are too young to understand the complexities of your situation. The choices made for you have been made by people with far more knowledge and experience than you possess." "Maybe they have more knowledge," Harry said, his voice growing stronger. "But they don't have to live with the choices. I do. And I'm saying no." McGonagall felt tears prick at her eyes. In 36 hours, this child had gone from apologizing for being hungry to standing up to the most powerful wizard of their age. It was a transformation that spoke to resilience that should never have been necessary, and strength that should never have been tested. "The boy has made his position clear," Snape said silkily. "Perhaps you should explain to your supporters exactly what you're asking them to help you accomplish. Are they here to assist in returning a child to documented abusers? Are they here to hold him down while you drag him back to a cupboard?" Kingsley and Emmeline exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Both were beginning to understand that they had been manipulated into participating in something that violated every principle they had sworn to uphold. "Albus," Kingsley said slowly, "perhaps we should reconsider." "There is nothing to reconsider," Dumbledore cut him off, his voice sharp with authority. "Harry Potter must return to Privet Drive. The protection cannot be maintained otherwise. And without that protection, he will be killed by Death Eaters within the month." "Then we'll protect him another way," McGonagall said flatly. "There are other forms of magical protection, other ways to keep him safe. We don't have to choose between his physical security and his psychological destruction. You are naive if you believe any protection can match what Lily's sacrifice provides," Dumbledore replied. "And you are reckless if you think your cottage can stand against the forces that will come for him." Snape stepped forward, his dark eyes glittering with satisfaction. "About that, Albus. I've spent the last month researching blood protection magic. Your interpretation of its requirements is flawed. The protection doesn't require abuse to function. In fact, systematic cruelty weakens it considerably. Potter is actually safer here, surrounded by people who care for his welfare, than he ever was at Privet Drive." The revelation hit Dumbledore like a physical blow. For the first time since entering the cottage, his composure cracked completely. "That's impossible. Your research was conducted with the conclusion already determined," Snape interrupted coldly. "You wanted justification for keeping Potter isolated and broken, so you found it. But the actual magic tells a different story." Harry looked between the adults, confusion replacing some of his terror. "So I was never really protected by staying with the Dursleys?" "No," McGonagall said gently. "You were weakened by it. Everything you suffered was for nothing, worse than nothing, because it made you less safe rather than more." The cottage fell silent, except for the sound of Harry's breathing, which had finally returned to normal. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but absolutely certain. "I'm not going back," he said. "I don't care what anyone says about greater good or protection or anything else. I'm staying here with Professor McGonagall, where people don't hurt me for existing." Dumbledore looked around the room, taking in the united front arrayed against him, the child who had found his voice, the supporters whose loyalty he was rapidly losing. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of a threat that would reshape their entire world. "Very well," he said softly. "But understand that by defying me in this, you have chosen to stand against everything I have worked to build. Harry's training, his preparation for the destiny that awaits him. All of it will be compromised by this decision. When the darkness returns, and it will return, the blood will be on your hands." He turned and walked through the ruined doorway, his supporters trailing behind with expressions of growing doubt and discomfort. Only when his magical presence had completely faded did McGonagall allow herself to lower her wand. Harry stood in the aftermath of the confrontation, looking older than his 11 years, but somehow lighter than he had been before. He had faced down absolute authority and emerged victorious, and McGonagall knew that whatever else happened, he would never again be the broken, voiceless victim the Dursleys had created. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Harry considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think so," he said finally. "It was scary, but I said no. I said no to him, and it worked." McGonagall smiled through her tears. "Yes, it did. And it always will, Harry. Your voice matters. Your choices matter. And anyone who tells you otherwise is someone you don't have to listen to." Outside the cottage, the Scottish morning was peaceful and bright, but McGonagall knew their war with Dumbledore had only just begun. The old man would not accept this defeat gracefully, and he had resources and allies they could barely imagine. But they also had something he had forgotten to value, a child who had found his voice, and adults willing to fight for his right to use it. And sometimes, McGonagall reflected, as she began repairing her ruined door, that was enough to change the world. Chapter 9. Legal Warfare. The courtroom in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes had never been intended for a case of this magnitude. Designed for disputes over property damage and minor magical mishaps, it now groaned under the weight of the most significant guardianship hearing in living memory. Every seat was filled, with reporters from the Daily Prophet, Witch Weekly, and even the Quibbler crowding against the barriers that separated the gallery from the proceedings. Minerva McGonagall sat at the petitioner's table, her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the storm raging in her chest. Beside her, The goblin barrister Griphook reviewed his notes with the methodical precision that made goblin law both feared and respected throughout the wizarding world. At the respondents' table, Albus Dumbledore conferred with a team of ministry solicitors, his calm demeanour intact despite the whispers that followed him wherever he went. Harry himself was not present. McGonagall had fought for that concession, arguing that forcing an abused child to testify in public about his suffering would constitute additional trauma. The hearing examiner, a stern witch named Amelia Bones, had agreed, though McGonagall suspected Harry's absence also protected the court from having to witness firsthand the evidence of what the wizarding world's greatest hero had endured. "This emergency hearing," Madam Bones announced, her voice cutting through the murmur of the packed courtroom, "will determine the temporary guardianship of Harry James Potter, currently age 11, following allegations of abuse and neglect by his previous caretakers. Petitioner McGonagall seeks to formalize emergency guardianship, while respondent Dumbledore maintains that the child's current placement violates established protection protocols." She turned her attention to McGonagall's table. "Griphook of Gringotts, you may present your opening statement." Griphook rose with fluid grace, his dark eyes sweeping the courtroom, before settling on the panel of 3 hearing examiners. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of centuries of legal tradition. "Honored examiners," he began, "we are here because the wizarding world has failed Harry Potter. For 10 years, this child, the symbol of our victory over darkness, was systematically tortured by the people entrusted with his care. This torture was not only known to certain authorities, but was actively enabled and protected by those same authorities for reasons that have nothing to do with the child's welfare, and everything to do with abstract concepts of greater good." A ripple of shocked whispers ran through the gallery. Several reporters leaned forward, quills moving frantically across parchment. "We will show," Griphook continued, "that Harry Potter was starved, beaten, confined in conditions that would be considered torture if applied to a prisoner of war, and denied basic human dignity for the entirety of his young life. We will show that this treatment was documented, reported, and deliberately ignored by those in positions of authority, and we will show that the supposed magical protections used to justify this cruelty were based on flawed understanding at best, deliberate misrepresentation at worst." Griphook paused, allowing his words to sink in. "Most importantly, we will demonstrate that emergency guardianship by Professor McGonagall represents not only Harry Potter's best interests, but his only realistic chance for survival and healing." The goblin sat down, and all eyes turned to Dumbledore's lead counsel, a polished wizard named Cornelius Fudge, who looked distinctly uncomfortable with his assigned role. "Honored examiners," Fudge began, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "While we do not dispute that young Mr. Potter's living conditions were challenging, we must consider the broader magical and security implications of his placement. Professor Dumbledore's decisions were made based on ancient magical protections that require specific family bonds to function. Removing Mr. Potter from his aunt's care may have rendered him vulnerable to attacks from Death Eaters and other dark forces." Fudge's voice gained confidence as he warmed to his theme. "We cannot allow emotional responses to individual suffering to override strategic necessities. The greater good of the wizarding world must take precedence over personal comfort." Madam Bones nodded curtly. "Thank you both. We will now hear evidence. Griphook, call your first witness." "I call Arabella Figg to the stand." Mrs. Figg made her way to the witness chair with visible reluctance, her lined face pale under the magical lights. McGonagall felt a pang of sympathy for the woman. Testifying against Dumbledore required courage that few possessed. Under Griphook's careful questioning, Mrs. Figg recounted 10 years of documented abuse. Her voice was steady but quiet as she described the reports she had filed, the escalating concerns she had raised, and the instructions she had received to minimize and sanitize her observations. "Professor Dumbledore told me," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "that Harry's discomfort was necessary for his character development. He said that a boy who had known only kindness would be unprepared for the sacrifices his destiny would require. "And what was your understanding of these required sacrifices?" Griphook asked. Mrs. Fig's hands twisted in her lap. I believed Professor Dumbledore meant that Harry might need to risk his life fighting dark wizards. I didn't understand that he meant Harry should be prepared to die, that he was being groomed for martyrdom." The courtroom erupted in shocked exclamations. Madam Bones pounded her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, while reporters scribbled frantically and several gallery members stood up for a better view of the proceedings. Fudge's cross-examination was perfunctory and clearly reluctant. He established that Mrs. Fig was a squib with limited magical understanding, but his heart clearly wasn't in undermining her testimony. When she left the witness stand, her devastating account hung over the courtroom like a toxic cloud. "I call Severus Snape to the stand." Snape approached the witness chair with his usual theatrical flair, his black robes billowing behind him. But when he began to speak, his voice carried none of his usual sneer or condescension. Instead, it held the cold precision of a man recounting facts too terrible for emotion. "I have reviewed extensive documentation of Harry Potter's living conditions," Snape said, in response to Griphook's first question. "As someone who experienced abuse as a child, I recognize the patterns with disturbing clarity." "Can you describe these patterns for the court?" Snape's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Systematic starvation used as punishment and control. Physical labor beyond the capabilities of a child his age. Isolation and sensory deprivation in the form of prolonged confinement. Verbal and emotional abuse designed to destroy self-worth and independence. These are not disciplinary measures. They are torture techniques. Griphook nodded gravely. "Did you attempt to inquire about Mr. Potter's welfare at any point during the past decade? 3 years ago, I requested permission to assess the boy's magical development. I was concerned about the documented suppression of accidental magic in abused children." Snape's voice took on a note of bitter irony. "Professor Dumbledore informed me that such assessment was unnecessary, as the boy was thriving in his placement. Did you accept this assessment?" "I accepted it because I trusted Professor Dumbledore's judgment and assumed he had access to more complete information." Snape paused, his black eyes scanning the courtroom. "I was wrong to trust, and Harry Potter suffered because of my failure to act on my instincts." Griphook consulted his notes. "Professor Snape, you have conducted research into the blood protection magic supposedly protecting Mr. Potter. What did you discover?" This was the moment McGonagall had been waiting for, the magical evidence that would undermine Dumbledore's entire justification for Harry's suffering. "Blood protection magic requires emotional bonds, not legal guardianship," Snape said clearly. "The protection is strengthened by genuine love and acceptance, not by suffering. Professor Dumbledore's interpretation of the magical requirements is not merely incorrect, it is precisely backwards. The abuse Harry Potter endured weakened his protections rather than strengthening them." The courtroom fell silent, except for the frantic scratching of quills. Several members of the Wizengamot in the gallery exchanged shocked glances, and McGonagall saw at least 3 officials frantically taking notes. Fudge's cross-examination of Snape was more aggressive, clearly aimed at undermining his credibility. "Professor Snape, is it not true that you were once a Death Eater? That your loyalty has been questioned in the past?" Snape's smile was sharp and unpleasant. "My past allegiances are well documented and have been thoroughly investigated by this very ministry. More relevantly, my expertise in blood magic and protective enchantments is unquestioned. Would you like me to explain the theoretical foundations of my conclusions, or are you satisfied with ad hominem attacks?" Fudge retreated quickly, clearly outmatched by Snape's intellectual authority and cutting wit. After Snape's testimony, Griphook presented the photographic evidence McGonagall had gathered during her surveillance. Enlarged by magic and displayed for the entire courtroom to see, the images of Harry's condition were devastating. Several gallery members gasped audibly at the photographs of his malnourished frame and the padlocked cupboard that had served as his bedroom. When Dumbledore took the stand in his own defense, McGonagall braced herself for the performance of a lifetime. The old man was in his element, wise, grandfatherly, speaking with the authority of someone who had guided the wizarding world through its darkest hour. "I do not deny that Harry's living conditions were harsh," he said, in response to Fudge's leading questions. "But we must consider the larger context. Harry Potter is not merely a child. He is a weapon forged by prophecy, a tool that may be our only hope against the return of Voldemort." Several people in the gallery flinched at the name, but Dumbledore continued, undaunted. "A weapon must be tempered by fire to be effective. A child raised in comfort and adoration might hesitate when asked to make the ultimate sacrifice for others. Harry needed to understand suffering before he could choose to end it." "And what specific sacrifice do you believe Mr. Potter will be required to make?" Griphook asked during cross-examination. Dumbledore's blue eyes, suddenly lacking their usual twinkle, met the goblin's stare directly. "If necessary, his life. The prophecy suggests that one cannot live while the other survives. I have been preparing Harry to make that choice willingly when the time comes." The admission hung in the courtroom like a curse. McGonagall watched as the implications sank into the minds of everyone present. Albus Dumbledore, the wizarding world's most respected leader, had spent 10 years conditioning a child to commit suicide on command. Even Fudge looked sick. "Professor Dumbledore," he said weakly, "surely you don't mean to suggest that Mr. Potter's death is inevitable?" "I mean to suggest that it may be necessary," Dumbledore replied calmly, "and that a boy who has known only kindness would be psychologically incapable of making that choice. Harry needed to learn that life is not precious, that existence can be a burden rather than a gift. The Dursleys, however, inadvertently taught him these essential lessons." McGonagall felt tears of rage and sorrow streaming down her face. In trying to defend his actions, Dumbledore had revealed the full extent of his monstrous calculation. He had broken Harry not in spite of caring for him, but because caring for him was inconvenient to his plans. The deliberation was brief. Madame Bones conferred with her fellow examiners for less than 30 minutes before returning with their verdict. "This court finds," she announced, her voice ringing with authority, "that the placement of Harry Potter with Vernon and Petunia Dursley constituted systematic abuse and endangered both his physical and psychological welfare. We further find that this placement was maintained despite documented evidence of ongoing harm, and that the supposed magical justifications for this placement were based on flawed or deliberately misrepresented magical theory." She paused, her eyes finding Dumbledore in the courtroom. "Most disturbingly, we find that this abuse was not merely tolerated, but was actively orchestrated as part of a plan to psychologically condition a child for martyrdom. This represents such a fundamental violation of our society's values that immediate action is required." McGonagall held her breath. "Emergency guardianship of Harry James Potter is hereby awarded to Professor Minerva McGonagall, effective immediately. Professor Dumbledore's authority over Mr. Potter's placement is permanently revoked. Furthermore, this court recommends a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding Mr. Potter's placement and the oversight failures that allowed this abuse to continue for a decade." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters rushed for the exits to file their stories, while gallery members shouted questions and opinions over the pounding of Madame Bones's gavel. McGonagall sat in stunned relief, barely able to believe that they had won. But even through her joy, she could see Dumbledore's face across the courtroom. His expression was calm, even serene, but his blue eyes burned with the cold fire of someone whose grand design had been thwarted by people too small-minded to understand the necessities of war. The legal battle was over, but McGonagall knew the war was just beginning. Dumbledore would not accept this defeat gracefully, and his resources for retaliation were vast and largely hidden. Protecting Harry from the Dursleys had been the easy part. Protecting him from Albus Dumbledore would be the challenge of her life. Chapter 10. Healing Foundations. The first thing Harry noticed about healer Lydia Clearwater was that she didn't look like any adult he had ever met. She was small, barely taller than McGonagall, with wild silver hair that defied all attempts at control and clothes that seemed to have been assembled from a rainbow's remnants. When she smiled at him from her chair in McGonagall's sitting room, her eyes crinkled at the corners in a way that spoke of genuine warmth rather than calculated manipulation. "Harry," she said, her voice carrying the soft burr of the Scottish Highlands, "I'm very pleased to meet you. Professor McGonagall has told me you've had quite a difficult time of things." Harry, who had spent the previous hour in a state of nervous anxiety about this appointment, found himself relaxing despite his intention to remain guarded. Something about healer Clearwater's presence was deeply calming, not the artificial calm that came from authority or power, but the natural peace that emanated from someone who had spent a lifetime helping others heal. "She says you help children," Harry said carefully, perched on the edge of the sofa with his hands folded in his lap. "Children who have been hurt." "I do," healer Clearwater confirmed. "And I'd like to help you, if you'll let me. But first, I want you to understand something very important. Everything we discuss stays between us unless you give me permission to share it. Professor McGonagall won't know what we talk about, and neither will anyone else. Your thoughts and feelings belong to you, Harry. No one else has a right to them." The concept was so foreign that Harry simply stared at her. In his experience, adults demanded to know everything, his thoughts, his feelings, his intentions, and used that knowledge as ammunition for punishment. "Even if I say something bad?" he asked quietly. "Especially then," healer Clearwater said firmly. "There are no bad thoughts or bad feelings, Harry. There are only feelings that hurt, and feelings that help, and feelings that confuse us. But none of them are wrong, simply for existing." Over the following weeks, Harry discovered that healer Clearwater was unlike any adult he had ever encountered. She never raised her voice, never demanded immediate answers, and never treated his fears or confusion as inconveniences to be dismissed. Instead, she listened with the patience of someone who understood that healing took time and couldn't be rushed. "The mind has its own way of protecting us," she explained during one of their sessions, as Harry struggled to articulate why he still flinched when McGonagall moved too quickly. "When we've been hurt for a long time, our minds learn to expect danger everywhere. It takes time to teach them that safety is real." "How much time?" Harry asked, frustrated with himself for jumping when a door slammed, or for hoarding food in his bedroom, despite knowing that meals would always be available. "However much time you need," healer Clearwater said gently. "Healing isn't a race, Harry. It's a journey. And like any journey, it goes at its own pace." The physical healing was more dramatic and visible. Within a month of proper nutrition and medical care, Harry had gained nearly a stone in weight. His hollow cheeks began to fill out, and his clothes, magically adjusted by McGonagall to fit his growing frame, no longer hung off him like burial shrouds. The dark circles under his eyes faded, as he learned that sleep was safe, that he wouldn't be dragged from his bed for pre-dawn chores or late-night punishments. Dr. Healer Marcus Flint, the wizarding pediatrician McGonagall had consulted, was amazed by Harry's resilience. Most children who have endured this level of systematic malnutrition would show permanent developmental delays, he told McGonagall during one of Harry's checkups. But his magical core seems to have protected his essential functions. Given proper care, he should make a complete physical recovery. Harry's magical education began not with textbooks or formal lessons, but with wonder. McGonagall started with simple demonstrations, making flowers bloom with a touch, turning teacups into songbirds, creating small lights that danced in the palm of her hand. Each spell was presented as a gift rather than a lesson, something beautiful to appreciate rather than a skill to master. "Magic is joy, Harry," she explained one evening as she made the fireplace flames dance in patterns that told the story of a brave knight and a grateful dragon. It's the universe's way of adding beauty and wonder to the world. Everything else, the fighting, the protection, the grand destinies, those are things we choose to do with our magic. But at its heart, magic is simply joy. Harry's first deliberate spell came on a rainy September afternoon as he sat in the cottage's small library, reading a book about magical creatures that Lupin had brought him. He was particularly fascinated by the entry on phoenixes, with their beautiful plumage and their songs of hope and healing. As he read, he found himself wishing he could hear what a phoenix song sounded like. The wish became intention, intention became magic, and suddenly the room was filled with the most beautiful sound Harry had ever heard. It wasn't coming from his throat, he couldn't produce such music, but from the air itself, as if his magic had reached out and captured a fragment of phoenix song from somewhere far away. McGonagall, who had been grading papers at her desk, looked up in amazement. "Harry," she said softly, "was that you?" Harry nodded, his eyes wide with wonder at what he had accomplished. "I didn't mean to do magic," he said quickly, the old reflexes of apologizing for accidental magic still strong. "I was just thinking about phoenixes and—" "You don't need to apologize for magic," McGonagall interrupted gently. "That was beautiful, Harry. You created something wonderful just by wanting to hear it." The phoenix song faded, but the smile on Harry's face lingered for hours. For the first time in his life, his magic had brought joy instead of punishment, wonder instead of fear. As September progressed, Harry's world expanded to include experiences he had only read about in books or observed from a distance. McGonagall taught him to play wizard's chess, patiently explaining strategies while letting him make his own mistakes. Snape, whose visits had become more frequent, introduced him to the art of potion-making, not as a subject to be mastered for grades, but as a form of magical cooking that combined science and intuition. "Potions are like recipes," Snape explained, as Harry carefully measured ingredients for a simple healing salve. But unlike Muggle cooking, magical brewing responds to the brewer's intentions and emotions. A healing potion, brewed with genuine care for the person who will use it, will be more effective than one made with clinical detachment. Harry discovered that he had a natural talent for potions, his careful hands and patient attention to detail serving him well. More importantly, he discovered that Snape, despite his intimidating appearance and sharp tongue, was actually a thoughtful teacher who took genuine pleasure in sharing his knowledge. "You have your mother's intuition for the subtle arts," Snape told him one afternoon, as Harry successfully brewed his first dreamless sleep potion. Lily could sense the exact moment when ingredients were ready to be combined. She never needed to watch the clock. It was the first time anyone had told Harry he resembled his mother in a positive way, and the words warmed him more than any praise for his appearance or his famous survival. Lupin's visits brought different gifts. Stories about Harry's parents that painted them as real people rather than tragic symbols. James's terrible jokes, Lily's fierce temper when she encountered injustice, their courtship that had involved 3 years of Lily insisting she couldn't stand James, followed by a sudden realization that she was completely in love with him. "Your father once spent an entire week trying to ask your mother to the Christmas dance," Lupin told Harry one evening as they sat by the fire. Every time he approached her, he would lose his nerve and end up asking her about homework instead. Lily finally got so frustrated that she asked him. Harry laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent and natural. "Did he say yes?" "Immediately," Lupin grinned. And then he ran straight into a suit of armor because he was so busy staring at her that he forgot to watch where he was going. These stories were treasure beyond measure, giving Harry a sense of identity that went beyond the boy who lived or the child who survived abuse. He was the son of James and Lily Potter, 2 young people who had been flawed and wonderful and completely, utterly human. Perhaps the most significant change was in Harry's relationship with choice itself. For the first time in his life, his preferences mattered. McGonagall asked what he wanted for breakfast, what books he wanted to read, what activities interested him. When he expressed curiosity about flying, she arranged for borrowed brooms and careful lessons in her garden. When he mentioned liking the sound of the violin, she found a music teacher who specialized in working with children. "I don't know what I like," Harry admitted one day, frustrated by the overwhelming array of options that freedom provided. "I've never been allowed to want things before." "Then we'll figure it out together," McGonagall said simply. "Wanting things is a skill like any other, Harry. It gets easier with practice." By the end of September, Harry had grown in ways that went far beyond physical healing. His magic, no longer suppressed by fear and trauma, responded to his emotions with increasing strength and subtlety. When he was happy, lights flickered brighter. When he was curious, books would fall open to exactly the pages he needed. When he felt safe and loved, which was becoming more frequent, the very air around him seemed to shimmer with potential. "Your magical core is remarkable," McGonagall observed one evening, as she helped him practice basic levitation charms. "Stronger than I've seen in any child your age. I suspect it was always this powerful, but the trauma suppressed its development." Harry nodded, concentrating on keeping a feather suspended in midair. "It feels different now. Like it's part of me, instead of something that happens to me." "That's exactly right," McGonagall smiled. "Magic is meant to be an extension of yourself, not a separate force you can't control. The fact that you can feel the difference means you're healing in ways that go deeper than the physical." That night, as Harry lay in his comfortable bed in his own room, he reflected on how much had changed since that grey morning when McGonagall had appeared at Privet Drive. He was taller, stronger, healthier in body and mind. He had people who cared about him, magic that responded to his will, and a future that stretched ahead, filled with possibilities rather than predetermined suffering. Most importantly, he had learned something that Dumbledore's grand plan had never accounted for. When a child is loved and protected and given the chance to grow, they become not weaker, but immeasurably stronger. The boy who had cowered in a cupboard was becoming someone who could face the world with confidence and joy. Harry Potter was healing, and in healing, he was discovering powers that no amount of orchestrated suffering could have produced. The power of trust, the strength that came from knowing he was valued, and the magic that bloomed when fear was replaced by love. For the first time in his life, Harry fell asleep not because he was exhausted from labor or hiding from punishment, but because he was genuinely tired from a day spent learning and growing and simply being a child. It was, he thought drowsily, the best feeling in the world. Chapter 11. The Hogwarts Question. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-September, delivered by an official ministry owl, whose pompous demeanor suggested the importance of its cargo. Minerva McGonagall opened the heavy parchment with growing unease, her eyes scanning the formal language until she reached the heart of the matter. "What is it?" Harry asked from across the breakfast table, where he was methodically working his way through what had become his favorite meal. Scrambled eggs with toast and marmalade, accompanied by hot chocolate that steamed gently in the morning light. "The Board of School Governors," McGonagall said carefully, setting the letter aside. "They're requesting a meeting to discuss your educational placement." Harry's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Over the past month, as his confidence had grown, he had become more attuned to the subtle tensions that still surrounded his situation. The wizarding world might have accepted the court's ruling about his guardianship, but that didn't mean all the complicated questions about his future had been resolved. "They want me to go to Hogwarts," he said. It wasn't a question. "They want to discuss your options," McGonagall corrected, though her tone suggested she understood exactly what kind of discussion the board had in mind. "You're 11 years old, Harry. In the normal course of events, you would have started your first year 3 weeks ago." Harry set down his fork and considered this. 3 weeks ago, he had still been jumping at sudden noises and hoarding food in his bedroom drawers. The idea that he might have been thrust into a school environment, surrounded by hundreds of other children, subject to academic pressures and social expectations, made his stomach clench with anxiety. "But these aren't normal circumstances," he said slowly, testing out the words that Healer Clearwater had been encouraging him to voice. "I'm not ready for school. Not yet." McGonagall's face softened with pride. 6 months ago, Harry would have accepted whatever adults decided for him without question. His growing ability to articulate his own needs and boundaries was one of the most encouraging signs of his recovery. "No," she agreed, "you're not. But the question is what we do instead, and how we handle the pressure that's building for you to return to a more conventional educational path." The pressure had been mounting since the guardianship hearing. Articles in the Daily Prophet questioned whether Harry Potter was receiving proper magical education. Several prominent wizarding families had written letters expressing concern about the precedent of removing children from established educational institutions. Most troubling of all, Dumbledore himself had remained ominously quiet about the entire situation, which McGonagall found far more concerning than if he had been actively opposing them. "Tell me about the options," Harry said, pushing his plate aside and leaning forward with the focused attention that had become characteristic of him when discussing important matters. McGonagall spread several pieces of parchment across the table. First, traditional Hogwarts attendance. You would live in Gryffindor Tower, attend classes with other first years, and follow the standard curriculum. The advantages are obvious. It's the finest magical education available in Britain, and it would allow you to form friendships with children your own age. "And the disadvantages?" Harry asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Dumbledore remains headmaster," McGonagall said bluntly. "While the court has stripped him of authority over your guardianship, he would still have significant influence over your daily life at school. More importantly, you would be thrust into a highly social, competitive environment while you're still healing from trauma. The stress could undo months of progress." Harry nodded slowly. The idea of living in a dormitory with other boys, of being constantly surrounded by people who knew his famous story, of having to perform academically while managing his emotional recovery. It all felt overwhelming. "What about the other options?" "Private tutoring," McGonagall continued. "We could arrange for specialist teachers to come here or to a similar private setting. You would receive personalized instruction tailored to your specific needs and interests, with the flexibility to progress at your own pace." "That sounds better," Harry said immediately. "But what about the social aspect? Healer Clearwater says it's important for me to spend time with other children." McGonagall smiled at his thoughtfulness. The fact that he was considering multiple aspects of his education, weighing benefits and drawbacks, showed a level of mature thinking that his early trauma had forced him to develop. "There are magical schools in other countries that might be more suitable," she offered. "Beauxbatons in France has smaller class sizes and a more nurturing approach to student welfare. The Salem Institute in America has an excellent program for students with special educational needs. Both would remove you from the immediate political pressures here in Britain." Harry was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes thoughtful. "What do you think I should do?" he asked finally. It was a question that went to the heart of everything they had been working toward. For 10 years, adults had made decisions about Harry's life without consulting him, justifying their choices with appeals to greater good or superior knowledge. McGonagall was determined not to repeat that pattern. "I think," she said carefully, "that you should decide what feels right for you, without worrying about what other people expect or want. This is your education, your future. You're the one who has to live with the consequences." Before Harry could respond, the cottage's Floo network activated with a whoosh of green flames. Severus Snape stepped through, brushing soot from his black robes with his usual theatrical precision. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly sorry. "But I bring news that affects the discussion you're undoubtedly having." McGonagall gestured for him to join them at the table. Over the past months, Snape had become an unexpected but valued ally in Harry's recovery. His dry wit and refusal to treat Harry as either a victim or a celebrity had provided a different, but equally important form of support. "The Board of Governors met yesterday," Snape announced without preamble. "They've passed a resolution demanding Harry's immediate enrollment at Hogwarts. Failure to comply, they claim, violates the Statute of Magical Education and could result in criminal charges." Harry's face went pale. "They can force me to go?" "They can try," Snape said, his black eyes glittering with something that might have been amusement. "However, their resolution contains a rather interesting flaw. It assumes that Hogwarts is the only institution qualified to provide Harry Potter with magical education." McGonagall leaned forward, recognizing the calculating tone that meant Snape had devised some form of clever solution. "What are you suggesting, Severus?" "I'm suggesting that we create an alternative," Snape replied smoothly. "A private educational institution specifically designed for students with exceptional circumstances. Properly licensed, fully accredited, and entirely independent of both the Ministry and Dumbledore's influence." The idea hung in the air between them, audacious in its simplicity. Harry looked between the two adults, his mind working through the implications. "You mean like a new school?" he asked. "Just for me." "Not just for you," Snape corrected. "For any student who requires specialized educational support. There are other children in the wizarding world who don't fit neatly into traditional institutional frameworks, those with unusual magical abilities, students recovering from trauma, children whose family circumstances make standard boarding school inappropriate." McGonagall felt a spark of excitement at the possibilities. "We could design a curriculum that prioritizes student welfare over institutional convenience. Smaller classes, individualized attention, therapeutic support integrated into the educational framework. More importantly," Snape added, "we could ensure that no student would ever again be sacrificed for someone else's vision of the greater good." Harry was quiet for several minutes, processing the enormity of what they were proposing, a school created specifically to address the gaps in the existing system, designed around the needs of students rather than the convenience of administrators. "Would you really do that?" he asked finally. "Create an entire school just because I'm not ready for Hogwarts?" "Harry," McGonagall said gently, "you're not the only child who has been failed by our educational system. The publicity surrounding your case has brought attention to problems that have existed for decades. Children from abusive homes, students with learning differences, those whose magical development doesn't follow conventional patterns, they all deserve better than what currently exists." Snape nodded. "Besides," he added with dry humor, "I've grown quite tired of Dumbledore's educational philosophy. The opportunity to implement something based on actual pedagogical research rather than manipulative sentiment is appealing." "You would leave Hogwarts?" Harry asked, clearly surprised. "I would leave the twisted institution it has become under Dumbledore's leadership," Snape corrected. "Hogwarts was once a place of genuine learning and growth. Perhaps it can be again. But not while it's being used as a training ground for child soldiers." McGonagall found herself nodding. The idea was radical, potentially career-destroying, and completely in line with everything they had been fighting for since that first day she had seen Harry collapsed in the Dursleys' garden. "It wouldn't be easy," she warned. "The Ministry would resist, the Board of Governors would oppose it, and Dumbledore would see it as a direct challenge to his authority." "Good," Snape said flatly. "It's time someone challenged the assumption that children exist to serve institutional needs, rather than the reverse." Harry looked between them, his young face serious with the weight of the decision he was being asked to make. "If we did this, if we created this school, Other children could come too. Children who need help like I did? If that's what you wanted, McGonagall confirmed. But the decision has to be yours, Harry. We won't create an institution in your name without your full consent and participation. The silence stretched as Harry considered the implications. Finally, he looked up with an expression that reminded McGonagall powerfully of his mother, determined, compassionate, and utterly committed to doing what was right. I want to try, he said quietly, not just for me, but for all the other children who might need somewhere safe to learn and grow. If we can create something better than what exists now, shouldn't we? McGonagall felt tears prick at her eyes. In that moment, she saw exactly what Harry Potter could become when given the chance to develop naturally. Not a weapon or a symbol, but a young person committed to making the world better for those who came after him. Then that's what we'll do, she said firmly. We'll create something new, something better, something that puts children first. Snape raised his teacup in a mock toast. To revolution through education, he said dryly. Dumbledore won't know what hit him. Outside the cottage windows, autumn was painting the Scottish Highlands in brilliant colours, and Harry Potter was beginning to understand that sometimes the most powerful magic wasn't found in spells or potions, but in the decision to care enough to change the world. Chapter 12. New Beginnings. The cottage garden had been transformed into something magical, and for once, the magic had nothing to do with spells or enchantments. Colourful banners hung between the apple trees, their fabric dancing in the October breeze. A long table groaned under the weight of more food than Harry had ever seen in one place, from his favourite shepherd's pie to an elaborate chocolate cake that Molly Weasley had insisted on baking, despite being a complete stranger to the birthday boy. This is too much, Harry said for the third time, standing in the cottage doorway and staring at the preparations with wide eyes. It's not even my real birthday. McGonagall, who was adjusting the placement of flowers with the focused attention she usually reserved for transfiguration theory, looked up with a smile that had become increasingly common over the past months. Your real birthday was spent locked in a cupboard, while people who should have protected you planned your return to abuse, she said gently. This is your actual birthday party, the celebration you should have had all along. It had been Healer Clearwater's suggestion during one of their weekly sessions. Harry had mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he had never had a birthday party, never blown out candles on a cake, never received presents given out of love rather than obligation. The idea that an 11-year-old child, especially this 11-year-old child, had never experienced one of childhood's fundamental joys, had galvanized everyone involved in his care. Besides, Remus Lupin added, emerging from the cottage with a stack of plates, October is a perfectly lovely time for a birthday party. Much better weather than July, really. Harry watched as more people arrived through the cottage's flu connection. Arabella Figg came first, bearing a wrapped package and looking years younger than she had during the guardianship hearing. Behind her came Kingsley Shacklebolt, who had become an unexpected ally after witnessing Harry's testimony. Even Griphook had arrived, bearing what appeared to be a goblin-forged silver compass that pointed not to magnetic north, but to whatever the bearer most needs to find. The transformation in Harry himself was perhaps the most remarkable magic of all. The skeletal child who had cowered in cupboards had grown into a boy who moved with easy confidence, whose face had filled out with proper nutrition, whose eyes sparkled with curiosity rather than fear. He was taller now, strong enough to help carry party supplies without his thin arms trembling from the effort. More importantly, he laughed easily and often, spoke up when he had opinions, and had developed the kind of natural charm that came from knowing he was valued. Harry, Severus Snape said, approaching with a wrapped gift that was precisely rectangular and suspiciously book-shaped. I trust you're prepared for the social obligations of gift receiving. Thank you notes will be required. It was the kind of dry humour that would have terrified Harry 6 months ago. Now he grinned back with the confidence of someone who understood that Snape's acerbic wit was a form of affection rather than criticism. "I'll write them in my best handwriting," Harry promised solemnly, "with proper grammar and everything." "See that you do," Snape replied, though his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners in what people who knew him well recognized as his version of a smile. As the afternoon progressed, Harry found himself at the center of attention in a way that felt warm rather than overwhelming. People wanted to hear about his progress in his private magical education, his thoughts about the new school they were planning, his interests and preferences and ideas. For the first time in his life, being noticed meant being celebrated rather than punished. The gifts were a revelation in themselves. Books on subjects he had expressed curiosity about, art supplies for the drawing hobby he had recently discovered, a small telescope for stargazing, clothes that fit properly and were chosen for his taste rather than handed down from someone else. Each present represented someone paying attention to who he was becoming rather than what he represented to the wizarding world. When it came time to blow out the candles on his cake, Harry stood before the 11 bright flames and found himself overcome with emotion. This should have happened months ago, on July 31st, in a world where adults protected children instead of using them. But it was happening now, and that was what mattered. "Make a wish," McGonagall encouraged gently. Harry closed his eyes and thought about all the children who were still locked in cupboards, still convinced they were freaks, still believing that suffering was love. When he opened his eyes and blew out the candles in one breath, his wish was not for himself, but for them, that they would find their own McGonagalls, their own chances for rescue and healing. As the party wound down and guests began departing through Floo powder and disapparition, McGonagall found herself reflecting on how profoundly this experience had changed her own life. 6 months ago, she had been a respected professor, content to work within established systems, trusting in institutional authority, even when her instincts urged rebellion. Now she was preparing to resign from Hogwarts to found a school based on revolutionary principles of child-centered education. "No regrets?" Severus asked, approaching her as she cleaned up the last of the party debris with lazy waves of her wand. "About which part?" McGonagall replied. "Defying Dumbledore? Challenging the Ministry? Giving up 30 years of career advancement to start over?" "Any of it." McGonagall looked toward the cottage, where Harry was helping Remus pack away the leftover food with the careful attention he still paid to anything involving sustenance. The boy was humming under his breath, a habit he had developed as his anxiety decreased and his natural joy emerged. "Look at him," she said simply. "Look at who he's becoming when given the chance to grow naturally. How could I regret anything that made this possible?" The changes went far beyond Harry himself. The publicity surrounding his case had forced the wizarding world to confront uncomfortable truths about child welfare and institutional accountability. New protocols were being implemented to prevent children from falling through the cracks of bureaucratic indifference. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures was facing scrutiny about the treatment of magical beings' children. Most importantly, the automatic deference to authority figures was beginning to crack as people realized that power did not automatically confer wisdom or righteousness. Dumbledore himself had become a diminished figure, his reputation irreparably damaged by the revelation that he had orchestrated a decade of child abuse for strategic purposes. Support for his leadership had evaporated as people understood that his greater good philosophy could justify any cruelty in service of abstract goals. He remained headmaster of Hogwarts, but his influence over broader wizarding society had been permanently undermined. "The Board of Governors approved our final proposal yesterday," Snape mentioned casually, as he helped vanish the last of the party decorations. "The Sanctuary School for Exceptional Students will open its doors next September." Harry looked up from his conversation with Remus, his face lighting up with excitement. "Really? It's official?" Official, McGonagall confirmed. Fully accredited, ministry approved, and completely independent of any existing institutional authority. We'll start with just a few students, children who need specialized support, but we can grow from there. And I'll really be involved in the planning? Harry asked. Not just as a student, but as someone who helps decide how things work. Your input will be essential, McGonagall assured him. After all, if we're creating a school designed to serve students rather than systems, who better to consult than someone who has experienced both sides of that equation? It was a radical concept, including students as partners in educational planning rather than simply as recipients of adult decision-making. But then, everything they were doing was radical by traditional standards. As the sun set over the Scottish Highlands, painting the cottage garden in warm, golden light, Harry found himself playing a game of catch with a conjured ball that sparkled with harmless magic. His movements were fluid and confident, his laughter genuine and frequent. When the ball sailed over his head, and he dove to catch it, tumbling onto the soft grass with a whoop of delight, McGonagall felt tears prick at her eyes. This was what childhood should look like. This was what Harry Potter should have been all along. Not a symbol or a weapon or a sacrificial offering, but simply a boy discovering the joy of being alive. "I'm happy," Harry announced suddenly, sitting up in the grass with the conjured ball clutched to his chest. "I know that probably sounds silly, but I am. I'm actually happy." It didn't sound silly at all. It sounded like the most profound magic McGonagall had ever witnessed. The transformation of a broken, terrified child into someone who could experience genuine joy. "You deserve to be happy," she said firmly. "Every child deserves to be happy, safe, and loved. That's not a privilege to be earned. It's a right to be protected." Harry nodded, his expression serious despite his obvious contentment. That's why the new school matters so much. So other children can learn that too. As twilight settled over the cottage, Harry Potter, no longer the boy who lived but simply Harry, a child with his own thoughts and dreams and preferences, continued playing in the garden. His laughter echoed across the Highland Valley, a sound of pure joy that spoke of healing accomplished and futures unlimited. For the first time in 11 years, Harry Potter was exactly where he belonged, safe, loved, and free to become whoever he chose to be. The cupboard under the stairs was a distant memory, replaced by a world of infinite possibility. And in that transformation lay the most powerful magic of all, proof that when adults choose to protect rather than use children, when institutions serve people rather than the reverse, when love triumphs over manipulation, even the most broken things can be made whole. The future stretched ahead, bright with promise and unmarked by predetermined destinies. Harry Potter had found his voice, his strength, and his joy. Now he would help others find theirs. It was, McGonagall reflected as she watched him play, exactly the ending that Lily and James Potter would have wanted for their son. Not an ending at all, but a beginning.